Hello everyone, I'm your storyteller. I know you're watching this to unwind and drift off to sleep. So before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And also, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it there? Let's allow the darkness to take over and set the mood. Now, flip your phone upside down, leave all your worries behind, and make yourself comfortable. Relax, and let's get started. The wind howled through the towering pines as I trudged through the snow, the crunch of my boots the only sound competing with the storm. It had been hours since I left the main road, following a winding path into the mountains. The promise of solitude, of a warm fire and peaceful night, had drawn me here like a moth to a flame. Yet, as the icy wind stung my face and the snowfall thickened, I began to wonder if I'd underestimated the journey. Then, through the swirling snow, I saw it. The cabin stood as if painted onto the landscape of vision, of rustic charm against the stark white canvas of winter. Its sloping roof wore a thick blanket of snow, and the soft orange glow of light from the small windows beckoned me like a distant memory of home. Relief washed over me as I quickened my pace, eager to leave the biting cold behind. The wooden door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound startling in the quiet. Inside, the cabin was exactly as I'd imagined it. Cozy, timeless, and alive with the kind of warmth that seems to hold the weight of many winters past. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, its flames licking the shadows that danced across the rough-hewn walls. The air smelled of pine wood and faintly of cinnamon, as if someone had been baking here not so long ago. I set down my bag near a chair that looked as if it had been waiting just for me. Pulling off my gloves, I let my fingers thaw in the fire's glow. The heat seeped into my bones, chasing away the cold, and I exhaled a long, deep sigh. It felt as if I had stepped out of one world and into another, a world where time slowed and worries melted away. But as I sat there, letting the cabin's stillness wrap itself around me, a peculiar sensation crept into my mind. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was ... awareness. Like the way you feel when you know someone's watching, even though no one's there. I glanced over my shoulder at the room behind me. It was simple, just as you'd expect. A small kitchen, a sturdy wooden table, and a door that likely led to a bedroom. Yet, the shadows in the corners seemed darker than they should have been, and the faint creaks of the cabin settling felt oddly deliberate. Shaking my head, I chuckled softly to myself. Too many ghost stories, I muttered under my breath. Still, I couldn't quite shake the unease. To distract myself, I explored the room, letting my fingers trail over the knickknacks that adorned the shelves. There were little carvings animals, mostly, with intricate details that suggested a skilled hand. A faded photograph caught my eye, its edges curling with age. It showed a family, a man, a woman, and a little girl standing in front of this very cabin. Their smiles were warm, but there was something about their eyes, or maybe it was just the dim light playing tricks on me. I placed the photo back and returned to the fire, determined to relax. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the window panes as if the storm were trying to claw its way inside. I leaned back in the chair, pulling a woolen blanket over my lap. The fire's warmth was intoxicating, and my eyelids grew heavy. But just as I began to drift off, a noise jolted me upright, a soft, deliberate knock at the door. My heart leaped into my throat. Who could possibly be out here in the middle of this storm? For a moment, I debated ignoring it, convincing myself it was just the wind. But then it came again, louder this time. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling slightly. There was no answer. Slowly, I stood and approached the door. My hand hovered over the latch as I hesitated. Something about this felt ... wrong. Summoning my courage, I opened the door. Snow swirled in the darkness, but there was no one there. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin, and looked around. The only footprints in the snow were my own, leading up to the cabin. Shivering, I closed the door quickly and bolted it. Back by the fire, I couldn't shake the unease that now gripped me. I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe a branch had struck the door in the wind. Yet deep down, I wasn't convinced. The cabin felt different now. The warmth of the fire was still there, but the shadows seemed to press closer, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Yet, the shadows in the corners seemed darker than they should have been, and the faint creaks of the cabin settling felt oddly deliberate. Shaking my head, I chuckled softly to myself. Too many ghost stories, I muttered under my breath. Still, I couldn't quite shake the unease. In my dream, they were seated by this very fire, their laughter filling the cabin. But their faces were different now, hollow, almost translucent. The little girl turned to me and whispered, her voice barely audible over the fire's crackle, "You're safe here." For now I woke with a start, my heart pounding. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly. The cabin was silent, save for the wind outside. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the remnants of the dream. But as I glanced at the mantel above the fireplace, something caught my eye: a new carving, one that hadn't been there before. It was small, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably fresh. And yet, as strange as it all seemed, a sense of calm washed over me. I was still here, the cabin still warm, the fire still glowing. Whatever mysteries this place held, they weren't mine to solve. Each pop and crackle was a note in an ancient song, one that soothed my soul and silenced the noise in my mind. Outside, the snowstorm raged, its icy winds howling through the trees and battering the cabin walls. Yet, inside, the fire reigned supreme, a guardian of warmth and tranquility. I leaned back against the armchair, letting out a slow, deliberate sigh. Each pop and crackle was a note in an ancient song, one that soothed my soul and silenced the noise in my mind. Outside, the snowstorm raged, its icy winds howling through the trees and battering the cabin walls. Yet inside, the fire reigned supreme, a guardian of warmth and tranquility. I leaned back against the armchair, letting out a slow, deliberate sigh. It was small, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably fresh, the outline of a hand, its fingers curling as if beckoning. And yet, as strange as it all seemed, a sense of calm washed over me. I was still here, the cabin still warm, the fire still glowing. Whatever mysteries this place held, they weren't mine to solve. As I stared into the flames, they seemed to take on a life of their own, their flickers and flares weaving stories only they could tell. One moment, they roared with intensity, their heat pulsing outward as if in triumph. The next, they settled into a gentle rhythm, their light soft and inviting, like a lullaby for the weary. The cabin creaked softly, the sound blending with the fire's song. It was an old creak, a familiar one, as if the wooden beams were settling into the warmth alongside me. I couldn't help but smile. The fire was more than a source of comfort. It was the cabin's heart, a steady pulse that connected me to the space in ways I hadn't expected. I reached for the steaming cup of tea on the small wooden table beside me, its aroma earthy and sweet mingled with the faint scent of burning pine a combination so soothing it almost brought tears to my eyes. I sipped slowly, the warmth spreading through my chest, as if the fire's essence had seeped into the tea itself. The shadows in the room shifted with the fire's light, stretching and shrinking, creating shapes that felt both familiar and mysterious. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something mauve flicker, too deliberate to be random. My gaze lingered on the corner of the room, where the shadows pooled darkest, but there was nothing there. Just the firelight playing tricks, I told myself. And yet, the sensation lingered, a whisper of something unseen, but not unfriendly. The logs in the hearth hissed, and a sudden crack broke the silence, jolting me slightly. I laughed under my breath, shaking my head. "Get a grip," I murmured to myself. The fire seemed to laugh with me, its flames flickering higher, as if to say, "Relax, you're safe here." And I was. The cabin felt alive, but not in a way that was frightening. It was welcoming, almost protective. The rhythmic dance of the flames began to pull me deeper into a peaceful trance. My breathing slowed, matching the rise and fall of the fire. I watched as the embers glowed, their light pulsating like the heartbeat of the earth itself. It was hypnotic, the kind of sight that quiets the soul and fills it with something deeper gratitude, perhaps, or a sense of connection to something timeless. I wrapped the woolen blanket tighter around me, the fire's warmth complemented by its soft embrace. The storm outside was relentless, but it might as well have been on another planet. As I stared into the flames, they seemed to take on a life of their own, their flickers and flares weaving stories only they could tell. One moment, they roared with intensity, their heat pulsing outward as if in triumph. The next, they settled into a gentle rhythm, their light soft and inviting, like a lullaby for the weary. The cabin creaked softly, the sound blending with the fire's song. The room dimmed, but the warmth remained, a testament to the fire's enduring presence. I stretched out on the rug, letting my body sink into its softness, and gazed at the embers. They pulsed faintly, like distant stars in the night sky, each one a reminder that even in the quietest moments, there is life. My eyelids grew heavy, the fire's symphony lulling me into a deep, restful calm. Before sleep claimed me, I whispered a quiet thank you to the fire, to the cabin, to the mountains that cradled this little haven. The fire didn't answer, but it didn't need to. Its warmth, its light, and its gentle crackle were all the reply I needed. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its warmth spreading through the room like a tender embrace. I leaned back in the armchair, cocooned in a thick blanket, listening to the sounds outside. The wind had been restless since the sun had set, and now it danced around the cabin with an almost playful ferocity. It whistled through the tall pines and swept over the snowdrifts, its voice a mixture of power and grace. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over me. The wind's howl wasn't harsh. It was melodic, a chorus of nature's raw beauty. Each gust seemed to carry its own story, whispering secrets of the mountains, of icy peaks and endless skies. It brushed against the windows and slipped through the tiniest gaps in the cabin's old wooden walls, creating a soft, almost musical hum. There was something comforting about it. Outside, the wind ruled, untamed and relentless, but here, within the cabin, the fire held its ground. The contrast was striking, the wild, restless energy of the storm and the steady, calming warmth of the fire. Together, they created a balance that felt like a reminder of life itself, the dance of chaos and calm. The cabin creaked occasionally, the old timbers shifting slightly under the wind's pressure. Each creak felt alive, like the cabin was speaking back to the storm, reassuring me that it had weathered many such nights and would stand strong through this one too. I couldn't help but feel a deep gratitude for this place, this refuge from the biting cold and howling winds. As I sat there, the wind's tone shifted. It wasn't just howling anymore, it was whispering. I leaned forward slightly, as if trying to catch the words it was trying to say. It was nonsense, of course, but the sound was so distinct, so deliberate, that it felt like a language I should understand. The low moans and high-pitched whistles rose and fell in waves, weaving a melody that stirred something deep inside me. I thought back to an old story my grandmother had once told me, about how the wind carried the voices of those who had wandered too far into the mountains. She'd told it with a twinkle in her eye, her tone light, but now, sitting alone in the cabin, the memory gave me a small, delightful shiver. It wasn't fear exactly, more like awe at the thought of the world being so alive, so filled with mystery. A sudden gust rattled the window pane, snapping me out of my thoughts. I glanced toward the frosted glass, half expecting to see something there, but it was just the night dark, impenetrable and vast. The fire behind me crackled loudly, almost as if it were reminding me of its presence, its steady light anchoring me amidst the storm's whispers. I reached for my mug of tea, the porcelain warm against my palms. As I sipped, the earthy sweetness mingled with the sounds around me, grounding me further in this moment. The wind, the fire, the gentle creak of the cabin, they all seemed to be part of the same symphony, each element playing its role in a song that had no beginning or end. The longer I listened, the more the wind felt like an old friend. It wasn't trying to intrude, it was simply passing by, pausing to share its tales before moving on to the next ridge, the next valley. And here I was, tucked away in my little corner of the world, a quiet observer of its journey. The fire began to settle, its once vivid flames softening into a steady glow. The wind outside followed suit, its howls quieting into gentle sighs, as if it too were growing weary. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, the warmth and sounds lulling me into a state of perfect peace. I closed my eyes again, the whispers of the wind fading into the background as sleep beckoned. The cabin, the fire, the wind, they were all part of a larger story, one that carried on whether I listened or not. As I sat there, the wind's tone shifted. It wasn't just howling anymore, it was whispering. I leaned forward slightly, as if trying to catch the words it was trying to say. It was nonsense, of course, but the sound was so distinct, so deliberate, that it felt like a language I should understand. The low moans and high-pitched whistles rose and fell in waves, weaving a melody that stirred something deep inside me. At first glance it seemed unremarkable. Its wood was rough and aged, the kind that told a story of time and seasons. The handle was a simple iron latch, slightly tarnished, and the door itself seemed oddly out of place, almost as if it had been forgotten. I tilted my head, curiosity prickling at the edges of my mind. How had I not noticed it before? I had spent hours in this cabin, every inch of it familiar or so, I thought. The room felt quieter now, the fires crackling subdued as if waiting. I stood, pulling the blanket tighter around my shoulders, and stepped closer to the door. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, a sound that echoed louder than it should have in the stillness. My heart quickened up from fear exactly, but from the thrill of discovery, the pull of the unknown. As I reached out to touch the latch, the wind outside gave a sudden gust, rattling the windows and making the flames in the hearth leap higher. I paused, glancing over my shoulder at the fire, its golden glow steady and reassuring. I took a deep breath, the air in the cabin carrying a faint scent of pine and something else, something older, like damp earth. My fingers brushed the cold metal of the latch, and a shiver ran up my spine. It wasn't the chill of the metal, but something deeper, as though the door itself held a memory. Slowly I pushed it open, the hinges groaning softly in protest. The door swung inward, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. I hesitated, the blanket slipping from my shoulders as I leaned forward. The air that drifted up was cool and slightly musty, carrying the faintest hint of something sweet, like dried flowers. The staircase was steep, its wooden steps worn and smooth, as though countless feet had once traveled them. I grabbed the lantern from the table beside me, lighting it with a match from the hearth, and stepped cautiously onto the first step. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable. Its wood was rough and aged, the kind that told a story of time and seasons. The handle was a simple iron latch, slightly tarnished, and the door itself seemed oddly out of place, almost as if it had been forgotten. I tilted my head, curiosity prickling at the edges of my mind. How had I not noticed it before? A small wooden table sat in the center, its surface covered in yellowed papers and a few unlit candles. The air was thick with a sense of history, a feeling that I had stepped into a place where time had paused. I moved closer to the table, my fingers grazing the edge as I examined the papers. They were maps, handwritten notes, and sketches of the surrounding mountains. One particular note caught my eye, its edges frayed and ink faded. It read, "The fire is the key. It guards the heart of the home." I glanced back toward the staircase, the faint glow of the hearth visible at the top. The fire, a strange comfort, settled over me, mixed with a curiosity that refused to be ignored. I spent what felt like hours exploring the room, each object telling its own quiet story. There was a carved wooden figure of a stag, a jar filled with what looked like dried lavender, and a book so old its spine crumbled slightly when I opened it. Eventually, I returned to the staircase, lantern in hand. As I climbed back to the main floor, the warmth of the fire greeted me like an old friend. The cabin seemed brighter now, as though it, too, had secrets to share, but was content to let them unfold in their own time. I closed the door behind me, its latch clicking softly, and returned to the armchair. The fire's flames flickered as if in acknowledgement, their light steady and strong. I sat there for a long time, watching the hearth and listening to the wind outside, a sense of wonder settling over me. The hidden door remained a mystery, but it wasn't one I felt the need to solve all at once. The cabin, with its fire and its whispers, held stories that would reveal themselves when the time was right. And as I drifted into a peaceful sleep, the sound of the wind and the crackling flames intertwined, a lullaby for the curious and the content. The fire crackled softly as I sat on the old rug, its warmth seeping into my back as the storm outside whispered through the trees. The cabin had become my sanctuary, a place where time seemed to slow. Tonight, though, as the wind sang its mournful tune, I noticed something different. The walls, lined with wooden panels worn smooth by years of life, seemed to hold more than their sturdy presence. They whispered too, not audibly, but through the trinkets and relics tucked away in forgotten corners. It started with a small shelf near the fireplace. The shelf itself was unassuming, its wood darkened with age, but the objects resting on it caught my attention. A tin box, slightly dented, sat alongside a framed black and white photograph. Curiosity tugged at me, and I reached for the photograph first. The image was faded, but clear enough to see a family gathered in front of the very same fireplace, their faces lit with wide smiles. There was a man with a thick beard, a woman whose eyes seemed to sparkle even in the worn picture, and two children, a boy and a girl, each clutching mugs as steam rose from them. They looked happy, comfortable, as if this cabin had been their haven just as it was now mine. I traced the edge of the frame with my thumb, imagining the laughter that must have echoed in this room. Next, I opened the tin box. Its lid creaked slightly, as if it hadn't been opened in years. And inside I found a collection of small treasures. A pressed flower, its petals brittle but still vibrant in color. A handwritten note on paper so thin, it felt like it might dissolve under my touch. And a rusted key. The note caught my attention first, its faded ink forming delicate looping letters. It read, "May this cabin always bring warmth to the hearts who seek it. We leave a piece of our joy behind for the next visitors." A smile tugged at my lips. Whoever had written it had understood the magic of this place. They'd seen it as more than just a shelter. It was a keeper of memories, a witness to lives lived and shared. I carefully set the box aside and stood, scanning the room with fresh eyes. What other stories might be hidden here? In the corner of the room, near a stack of firewood, I noticed another photograph pinned to the wall with a thumbtack. This one showed a young couple, their arms wrapped around each other as they stood in the snow outside the cabin. The fire had begun to settle into a soft glow, its earlier crackles fading into gentle pops as the cabin embraced the stillness of the night. I leaned my head against the armrest of the chair, the photographs and trinkets now arranged neatly on the small table beside me. I continued my quiet exploration, finding small artifacts tucked away like secrets waiting to be uncovered. A leather-bound journal, its pages filled with entries about hikes through the snow and nights spent stargazing. A tiny wooden carving of a bird, its details so intricate it seemed almost alive. And an old scarf, its fabric frayed but still carrying the faint scent of pine. As I uncovered each piece, a strange sensation filled me, not sadness, but a kind of wistful longing. These weren't my memories, yet they felt familiar, as though the cabin itself was sharing a part of its soul with me. The walls had absorbed decades of laughter, love, and quiet moments, and now they were offering those fragments of life as a gift. The fire dimmed slightly, its flames settling into a steady rhythm, and I found myself returning to the rug, the tin box and photographs beside me. I stared into the hearth, imagining the countless faces that had sat in this same spot, gazing at the same firelight. What stories had they told? What secrets had they shared with the crackling flames? I picked up the rusted key from the tin box, turning it over in my fingers. It was small and simple, but its weight felt significant, as if it had once opened something important. I glanced around the room, wondering if there was still a lock somewhere waiting for this key. But instead of searching, I placed it back into the box, deciding to let the mystery remain. Some secrets, I thought, were meant to stay untold. As the night deepened, I felt a peacefulness settle over me like the weight of a soft blanket. The cabin had been alive long before I arrived, its walls holding the echoes of countless lives. And in this moment, I felt connected to all of them, to the family in the photograph, to the couple in the snow, to the writer of the note. Their stories were woven into the fabric of this place, and now mine was too. I leaned back against the armchair, letting the fire's warmth lull me into stillness. The wind outside had quieted to a gentle sigh, as if it too was resting. My eyelids grew heavy, and just before sleep claimed me, I whispered a silent promise to the cabin to cherish its memories and to leave behind a little of my own joy for whoever might come next. The fire had begun to settle into a soft glow, its earlier crackles fading into gentle pops as the cabin embraced the stillness of the night. I leaned my head against the armrest of the chair. The photographs and trinkets, now arranged neatly on the small table beside me, my thoughts were still dancing among the fragments of other people's lives, when I noticed something outside the frosted window, a quiet transformation unfolding beyond the glass. Snow was falling, its descent slow and deliberate, like feathers released into the wind. The flakes swirled in graceful spirals, catching the faint moonlight that managed to pierce the clouds. Each one seemed unique, a fleeting masterpiece crafted by winter itself. They blanketed the landscape with a softness that felt almost sacred, muting the sharp edges of the world and wrapping it in a hushed stillness. I rose from the chair, drawn to the window by the sheer tranquility of the scene. Pressing my hand gently against the cold glass, I peered out at the forest beyond the cabin. The tall pines stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with snow, and the ground glistened as if a million tiny stars had fallen from the sky to rest there. The wind had quieted completely now, leaving only the sound of snow meeting snow, a faint whisper that seemed to echo eternity. The cabin felt smaller in the presence of such vast, serene beauty. It was as though nature had paused for a moment, holding its breath to honor this act of quiet creation. My chest tightened, not from fear or sadness, but from an overwhelming sense of gratitude. It was a rare privilege, I thought, to witness the world like this, to see it dressed in its purest form, untouched and unspoiled. I turned away from the window and reached for the woolen blanket draped over the back of the chair. Wrapping it around myself, I opened the cabin door just enough to step out onto the covered porch. The cold air kissed my cheeks, sharp but invigorating, and I drew the blanket tighter around my shoulders. The snowflakes fell more thickly now, their patterns shifting as the wind returned, but only faintly, a soft sigh rather than the earlier howl. The storm from before seemed a distant memory, replaced by this gentle serenade. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, watching the snowfall reshape the world into something quieter, kinder. The night sky above was still clouded, but there was a promise of stars waiting just beyond the veil. As I stood, I noticed footprints leading away from the porch, my own from earlier. I wasn't sure. They were faint now, partially filled by the fresh snow, but they stirred something in me, an awareness of time passing, of moments slipping into the past like the snowflakes melting into the ground. I returned inside, my footsteps soft against the wooden floor as I closed the door behind me. The fire greeted me with its warmth, and I sank back into the armchair, cradled by the blanket. The cabin had shifted somehow, its quiet now more profound, its walls seeming to hum with the serenity of the snow outside. I thought about the memories hidden in the cabin, the photographs, the notes, the small treasures, and how they were all snapshots of lives lived in the midst of this same quiet wonder. Did those who came before me stand on that porch as I had, marveling at the snowfall? Did they feel this same sense of awe, this deep connection to something far greater than themselves? The snow continued its silent dance, and the cabin seemed to breathe with it, the firelight flickering in time with the rhythm of nature. My eyes grew heavy, and as sleep began to pull me under, I whispered a soft goodnight to the snowfall, to the cabin, and to the world blanketed in its serene embrace. The last thing I heard before drifting into dreams was the faint sound of the snow's melodia, lullaby composed by the mountains themselves, soothing and eternal. It was a night that held no fear, no pain, only the quiet promise of peace and the beauty of being present in a moment that felt infinite. The fire crackled softly, its golden light playing across the walls, as the snowfall outside continued its peaceful descent. Wrapped in the warmth of the blanket, I had nearly drifted into a serene sleep when my gaze fell on something near the hearth. It was faint at first, just a shadow against the brick ledge. But as the flames flickered, the object revealed itself a book, old and leather-bound, its spine cracked with age. I hesitated for a moment. It seemed strange that I hadn't noticed it before. Perhaps it had been tucked away, hidden in the corner where the firelight didn't reach. But now, as if drawn out by the night itself, it sat there, waiting to be discovered. My curiosity stirred, and I leaned forward to pick it up. The leather felt smooth but worn, like it had been handled many times over the years. A faint earthy smell rose from an admix of aged paper and the faintest hint of smoke, as if it had spent years absorbing the very essence of this cabin. The edges of the pages were tinged with yellow, and a simple clasp held it closed. There was no title, no indication of what lay inside, but my pulse quickened as I undid the clasp and opened it. The first page bore a name, written in elegant cursive, Eleanor Wells, winter of 1938. Beneath it, a short inscription, for the days that feel eternal and the nights that whisper secrets. The words sent a shiver through me, not a cold, fearful shiver, but something deeper, a sense of stepping into someone else's story. Eleanor's voice seemed to rise from the pages as I read on. The journal was filled with entries written in careful, flowing handwriting. The first few pages were light-hearted, describing her arrival at the cabin and her wonder at the snow-covered mountains. She had come seeking solitude, a respite from a life that had grown too noisy, too heavy. There was a joy in her words, a sense of discovery as she described the quiet mornings by the fire, the crisp air that filled her lungs during her walks, and the way the stars seemed brighter here than anywhere else. But as I turned the pages, the tone shifted. Eleanor began to write about a sorrow she carried with her, a loss that had driven her to the cabin. She didn't name it outright, but her pain was woven into her words. She spoke of sitting by the fire late at night, the flames dancing like memories just out of reach, and of the silence that sometimes felt comforting, other times overwhelming. One entry stopped me entirely. It was dated 2 weeks after her arrival. She wrote, "There's something about this place. It holds more than warmth, it holds the echoes of those who came before, their laughter, their tears. Sometimes I think I hear it in the wind, or see it in the way the fire flares suddenly. I don't know if it's the mountains or the cabin itself, but I feel less alone here, even when I'm by myself." I looked around the cabin, her words resonating in a way I couldn't explain. Had I felt the same thing? The sense of connection to the lives that had touched this place, the way the walls seemed alive with stories. The fire popped sharply, as if answering my unspoken question, and I smiled faintly. As I read further, Eleanor began to describe a visitor, a man, who had come to the cabin during a storm, seeking shelter. She wrote about their shared evenings by the fire, the conversations that stretched into the early hours, and the unexpected bond they had formed. Her words were filled with tenderness, a glimpse of hope blooming amidst her sorrow. But the entries grew more sporadic after that, the handwriting slightly messier, as if written in haste or distraction. The final entry was short, almost abrupt. The snow is falling again. He left this morning. I don't know if I'll see him again, but I'll carry this place with me always. It's strange I came here to be alone, but I'm leaving with a heart fuller than I expected. For that, I am grateful. I closed the journal slowly, my fingers lingering on its cover. Eleanor's story felt unfinished, yet complete in its own way. She had come to the mountains with a weight on her soul, and though her journey hadn't erased her pain, it had given her something else: peace, connection, a sense of belonging. The firelight flickered across the room, casting soft shadows that danced against the walls. I held the journal close for a moment, as if by doing so I could absorb a piece of Eleanor's strength, her resilience. Then I placed it back on the ledge near the fireplace, where it seemed to belong. As I settled back into the armchair, the snowfall outside continued its gentle serenade, and I felt a deep sense of calm wash over me. The cabin, the journal, the night itself, all of it seemed to whisper the same truth, that even in the quietest moments, there is a beauty in simply being, in allowing yourself to be part of something greater. I closed my eyes, the warmth of the fire cradling me, and let sleep take me. The journal's words stayed with me, their echoes mingling with the snow's lullaby. It was a night of stillness, of stories, of remembering that every moment, no matter how small, holds a piece of eternity. The cabin had grown quieter as the night deepened, its warmth and silence wrapping around me like a cocoon. The fire had settled into a gentle rhythm, its flames low but steady, casting a soft glow across the room. I found myself staring at the windows, where frost had crept up the panes in intricate patterns, delicate and mesmerizing. Each pane was its own masterpiece, the frost-weaving tendrils and swirls that looked like frozen vines or the veins of a leaf. I leaned closer to the nearest window, my breath fogging the glass as I traced a finger near the icy edges. It felt as though winter itself had left its signature here, a quiet reminder of its beauty and power. The patterns shimmered faintly, catching the light from the fire, and for a moment, I could almost believe they were alive, growing and changing as I watched. Behind the frost, the snow continued to fall, its dance illuminated by the dim light filtering from the cabin. The world beyond the window seemed distant, like a dream wrapped in a silvery haze. The only movement came from the occasional shift of the trees as the wind brushed past them, their shadows stretching long and thin across the snowy ground. Inside, the fire cast its own shadows, flickering against the walls and ceiling in an ever-changing display. It was as if the cabin itself was alive, breathing in time with the flames. The shadows moved like storytellers, weaving tales in the language of light and dark. Some shapes were familiar, a flick of a branch, the curve of a chair leg, while others seemed to take on a life of their own, fleeting forms that teased the edge of recognition before vanishing. I sat back in the armchair, the blanket pulled snugly around me, and let my mind wander. The interplay of frost and shadows created an almost magical atmosphere, a space that felt both timeless and fleeting. It was the kind of beauty that demanded nothing, asked no questions, and yet filled you with a quiet sense of awe. As I watched, a shadow near the far wall caught my attention. It was small and faint at first, barely distinguishable from the others, but it seemed to grow stronger, more defined. My heart gave a soft thud, not of fear, but of curiosity, a momentary lapse in the tranquility of the night. The shadow looked like a figure. No, it was just the fire's flicker, playing tricks on my eyes. Still, I couldn't look away. The shape lingered longer than it should have, its edges blurred but unmistakably human. A chill ran down my spine, not from the cold, but from the strange, inexplicable feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. I took a deep breath, willing myself to relax. Shadows had a way of tricking the mind, especially in the soft glow of firelight. I stood and approached the fire, adding another log to its embers. The flames flared briefly, their warmth and light pushing back the shadows, filling the room with a renewed sense of safety. The figure dissolved into nothingness, just a product of my imagination. I chuckled softly at myself, shaking my head as I returned to the chair. Yet, as I settled back in, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin was more than it seemed. Its walls, its frost-covered windows, even its flickering shadows, they all held secrets, whispers of stories long past. I glanced at the forgotten journal on the hearth, its cover catching the light for just a moment, as if inviting me to return to its pages. But not tonight. Tonight was for observing, for being still, for listening to the quiet song of the frost and fire. My eyelids grew heavy, the warmth of the flames lulling me toward sleep. The shadows continued their dance, their movements softer now, less distinct, as if even they were settling into the stillness of the night. I let my eyes close, the frost's intricate patterns and the fire's flickering glow etched into my mind. The cabin had become a sanctuary, a place where even the wind's whispers and the shadows' play felt like part of a greater harmony. And as I drifted into dreams, I carried that sense of peace with me, a quiet reminder that even in the coldest of winters, warmth and wonder could be found. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its warmth still wrapping around me like a gentle embrace. But as I sat back in my chair, my gaze wandered once again to the fireplace. The flickering flames cast shadows over the mantel, illuminating the room in a dance of light and dark. It was a place I had come to find comfort and peace. But tonight, there was something that caught my eye, something I hadn't noticed before. It was a small, intricate carving etched into the wood of the mantelpiece. I had passed by it many times, never giving it much thought. But tonight, under the dim light of the fire, the carving seemed to stand out more than ever before. My heart gave a small, almost imperceptible jolt as I leaned forward to get a closer look. The symbol was strange, unlike anything I had ever seen. It wasn't just the design that was odd. It was the way it seemed to shimmer in the firelight, as if it were alive. The edges were worn, smooth from time, but the lines were sharp, deliberate, and precise. The symbol resembled an old, twisted knot circular, with loops that seemed to coil into each other, overlapping in an endless cycle. It was almost hypnotic, pulling my gaze deeper into its pattern, like a whirlpool that beckoned with an eerie sort of invitation. I ran my fingers lightly over the carving, the wood cooled to the touch. There was something strange about the texture. It felt softer here, almost as if the wood had been carved long ago, but had changed over time. The lines seemed to shift slightly under my fingertips, as if responding to the touch. A chill crept up my spine, though the fire's heat still radiated around me. A part of me wanted to pull away, to ignore the odd sensation that had settled deep in my chest, but curiosity tugged at me. I knew this cabin was old, but this symbol, this strange presence, felt like it belonged to a different time. A time before the cabin had been here, before the fires had been lit, before I had found my way to this place. The flames in the hearth crackled louder, snapping me out of my thoughts. I pulled my hand back, as if the carving had burned me, but I could still feel its presence, A small part of me wanted to dismiss it, chalk it up to old wood, the shifting shadows of the fire, or just my imagination running wild in the quiet of the night. But deep down, I knew better. There was something about that symbol that felt ... important. I turned my attention back to the fire, willing myself to relax. The flames leaped and danced, their shadows throwing strange shapes across the walls. But no matter how much I tried to push the thought away, my eyes kept darting back to the mantle. The symbol seemed to pulse with a quiet energy, as though it were calling me, beckoning me to unravel its secret. My mind wandered, wondering who had carved it there and why. The cabin had once belonged to an old couple, I had heard. Perhaps they had left behind some sign of their lives, their stories, their beliefs. But even that explanation didn't seem to satisfy the feeling in my gut. I had lived in this cabin for days now, and this was the first time I had truly noticed the carving. How could something so distinct have escaped my notice for so long? I shook my head and stood up, my body stiff from sitting too long. Maybe I needed a walk, something to clear my mind. But as I moved toward the door, something stopped me, something deeper, more primal. I turned back to the fire, the flickering shadows still stretching across the walls, but now they seemed different, darker. The shape of the carving seemed to ripple in the fire's glow, its loops twisting like the motion of a serpent, its cold presence lingering in the room. I glanced around the cabin, the silence suddenly pressing in on me. The wind outside had picked up, its soft howls brushing against the windows. But here, in the heart of the cabin, it was as if the world had gone still. Only the soft crackling of the fire and the persistent whisper of the wind remained. Even the shadows seemed to hold their breath. I took a step back toward the mantle, drawn in despite myself. My fingers hovered over the symbol again, but this time I hesitated. There was a heaviness to the air, something old and forgotten that lingered in the space between the walls. The fire seemed to grow dimmer, casting longer, darker shadows, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I could have sworn that the symbol was ... moving. My heartbeat quickened, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Was it possible? Could the fire be creating this illusion, bending the light around the carving to trick my eyes? Or was something else at play? I couldn't say for sure, but the unease creeping through my veins told me that there was more to this cabin and its strange, mysterious carving than I had yet understood. Suddenly, a gust of wind howled through the cracks in the cabin, making the walls groan in protest. The flames in the hearth flared, casting a brief, intense light across the room. In that moment, the symbol seemed to glow brighter, more vivid, as if it had come to life with the wind. A chill swept over me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. It was as if the symbol had awakened something deep within the cabin, something ancient and unspoken. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I had come here for peace, for rest, but tonight, the cabin felt different. There was a mystery lingering in the air, an invisible thread connecting the past to the present, pulling at me, urging me to look closer. For a long moment, I just stood there, my hand hovering over the strange carving, the flickering shadows dancing in the firelight, and the wind whispering its secrets outside. The night felt endless, filled with possibilities and unanswered questions. But in that moment, I felt something else, something deeper. Despite the unease, despite the strange energy in the room, I felt at home. The fire, the shadows, the frost on the windows, they were all part of this place. A place where time had woven together stories of love, loss, and mystery. And as I took a final glance at the symbol, I knew that whatever secrets it held, whatever stories it whispered, would be revealed in their own time. Until then, I would sit back by the fire, let the warmth surround me, and listen to the silent song of the mountains. For in the quiet, even the most unsettling mysteries could find their place. The night had settled around the cabin, wrapping it in a quiet stillness that seemed to fill the air with an almost sacred peace. The fire in the hearth continued its slow, steady dance, casting soft, golden light across the room. Shadows wavered and stretched, but the warmth from the flames pushed against the coldness of the night outside. I had spent most of the evening lost in the mystery of the strange carving on the mantel, but now, as the night wore on, the thoughts of the symbol had faded into the background of my mind. The unsettling feeling had settled, replaced by a comforting weight in my chest, the quiet that could only be found when the world outside seemed to pause. I needed something to bring me back to myself, something that would ground me. So I stood up, stretching my arms toward the ceiling, letting out a slow breath. The room seemed to shrink in around me, cozy and safe. I turned toward the small kitchen corner where I had left a simple, comforting, promise-hot cocoa. The kettle was still warm on the stove, and as I lifted it to pour the steaming milk into a mug, I felt a sense of tranquility settle deep within me. The ritual of making cocoa was a small act, but one that carried so much warmth, so much peace. There was something about it that made me feel like I was being cared for, even when I was all alone. The scent of cocoa filled the room as I stirred in the rich, velvety powder, watching it dissolve in the warm milk. A pinch of cinnamon, a dash of vanilla. The mixture swirled together like a soft hug, the steam curling up in delicate tendrils that felt almost magical. With each stir, I felt myself slowing down, letting go of the tension that had wound its way into my muscles during the day. It was a simple thing, really, but sometimes the simplest moments are the ones that carry the most weight. As I took the mug in my hands and made my way back to the fire, I felt my body relax, the weight of the world outside melting away. The warmth of the cocoa spread through me, filling every inch with comfort, and for a moment, all I could do was close my eyes and savor the feeling. It was a simple indulgence, but it felt like the perfect ending to a long, challenging day. Sitting back in my favorite chair, I pulled the soft wool blanket around my shoulders. The heat from the fire on my face, the gentle steam rising from the mug, and the quiet sound of the world outside all blended together into a perfect harmony. In the flickering light of the flames, everything seemed to soften, to take on a dreamlike quality. I sipped the cocoa slowly, letting its warmth settle deep inside. The taste was rich and creamy, with just the right balance of sweetness. It reminded me of winter's long past of cold mornings spent with my family, gathered around a fire, much like this one. My mother's soft voice telling stories, my father's deep laughter filling the room. Those were the memories that had always brought me comfort when the world outside felt cold or harsh. I turned toward the small kitchen corner where I had left a simple, comforting promise hot cocoa. The kettle was still warm on the stove, and as I lifted it to pour the steaming milk into a mug, I felt a sense of tranquility settle deep within me. The ritual of making cocoa was a small act, but one that carried so much warmth, so much peace. There was something about it that made me feel like I was being cared for, even when I was all alone. A place where all that mattered was the present moment, and in that moment, nothing was wrong. Everything was as it should be. I thought back to the days when I had first found this cabin how I had come here looking for peace, looking for solitude, looking for a place to quiet my mind and rest my soul. And now, as I sat here by the fire with the warmth of the cocoa in my hands, I realized that I had found exactly what I had needed. There was something about the mountains, about the stillness of the world here, that felt like a balm for the soul. The noise of the world, the rush and hurry of everyday life, all seemed so far away. Here, there was nothing to do but just be. And in that stillness, in that peace, there was room for everything to unfold at its own pace. As the fire crackled and the shadows danced on the walls, I closed my eyes and leaned back in the chair, the cocoa warming my insides like a soft embrace. It was moments like this, simple moments of bliss, that made the world feel right again. The troubles of the day melted away, leaving nothing but the feeling of contentment. The wind outside continued its mournful song, but inside the cabin, it was a different world. A world where the warmth of the fire and the comfort of hot cocoa could erase the worries and tensions of the day. A world where time seemed to slow, where the only thing that mattered was the feeling of peace that filled every corner of the room. I took another slow sip from the mug, letting the rich taste linger on my tongue. The warmth spread through me, comforting me in a way that words could never describe. It wasn't just the cocoa, it was the simple act of taking a moment to pause, to breathe, to be here. It was the reminder that in a world that often felt chaotic, there were still moments of stillness, moments of serenity. And so, as the fire burned lower and the night stretched on, I sat in my chair, wrapped in the warmth of the cocoa and the flickering shadows. The world outside might have been cold and harsh, but here, by the fire, there was only peace. For a while, I let the silence wrap around me, the crackling fire the only sound in the room. And as the last sip of cocoa warmed my soul, I realized that this small, quiet moment was everything. It was all I needed. As the night deepened and the fire began to settle into embers, I felt my body relax even further, my eyelids growing heavy. The simple joy of this quiet, cozy evening in the mountains, with nothing more than the fire, the cocoa, and the memories to carry me, filled me with a profound sense of calm. And with that, I allowed myself to let go, to surrender to the peaceful embrace of sleep, knowing that when I woke, the fire would still be there, and the world would still be waiting for me to find joy in its simple, quiet moments. As the fire settled into a steady, murmuring glow, I leaned back in my chair and let the weight of the day melt away. The last embers of sunlight had faded hours ago, and the night outside had deepened, a dark, quiet blue pressing against the window pane. A heavy snowfall had begun earlier in the evening, and now, outside, the world was draped in a shimmering veil of white. Every flake was silent, untouched by the wind, and they floated down in soft whispers, like the sighs of a long-forgotten memory. The only sound now was the comforting crackle of the fire, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo around me. It was a sound I had grown to love, the heartbeat of the cabin itself. But as I sat there, sipping my cocoa, a faint shiver traced its way down my spine. Something about the quiet felt different. It was as if the room was holding its breath, waiting. For what? I couldn't quite say. And then, just as I was about to dismiss the sensation, I felt it. A prickle on the back of my neck, as though I was being watched. I looked around the room, scanning the shadows that danced on the walls. But there was nothing out of place, nothing to explain the sudden chill that had seeped into the air. And yet, there was a feeling of very subtle undercurrent that made me pause. It was almost as if I could sense someone, or something, just out of view, eyes following me from the corners of the room. My heartbeat quickened, and I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the strange feeling. But try as I might, I couldn't escape the sensation of being observed. It was a strange feeling, one that I hadn't experienced since the first time I came to the cabin. Back then, it was as if the walls themselves held secrets, stories that whispered faintly in the air. But now, the sensation was stronger, more urgent. I was alone, I reminded myself. There was no one else here. But still, I couldn't shake the unease. I reached for the mug of cocoa, taking a deep breath. The familiar scent of cinnamon and chocolate helped steady me a little, but the strange feeling lingered, an undercurrent beneath the calm. I focused on the dancing flames instead, watching the play of light on the hearth as the fire flickered with a soft, hypnotic glow. The shadows of the flames seemed to stretch, bending with the slight crackling sound, as if they were reaching out into the room. And then, quite suddenly, I saw something that made my heart leap. There was a flicker in the corner of the room, a movement of something dark that seemed to pass by the edge of the hearth. My breath hitched, and I set the mug down quickly, as though the very act of holding onto it had grounded me in some way. I waited, listening to the sound of my own pulse, the rhythm matching the soft roar of the fire. And then, very slowly, I got up, drawn by a whisper I could hardly hear, a whisper that seemed to call to me from the shadows. I moved cautiously across the room, feeling an inexplicable draw toward the mantel. My heart was pounding now, and I could feel the pulse of fear starting to build. Each step was deliberate, slow, almost as if I were moving in a trance. And then, as I reached the mantel, I saw it, the strange carving I had noticed before. It was like nothing I had ever seen, a series of intersecting lines looping around one another, almost like a puzzle waiting to be unlocked. The lines seemed to shimmer, as if they were pulsing with a hidden light. And it was then that I noticed something else. As I gazed at the carving, I saw a pair of flickering lights deep within the etching, like small sparks glowing just beneath the surface. They were blue, like moonlight, and they seemed to pulse gently, as though something was alive beneath the wood. My pulse quickened again, and I stepped back, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "What are you?" Silence hung in the room, save for the low murmur of the fire, but those strange blue lights seemed to echo in the stillness. It was as if the walls of the cabin held 1,000 untold stories, all converging in this one place, around this one object. I reached out tentatively, as if compelled by some unseen force, placing my hand on the wood of the mantel. And as I did, a shiver ran down my spine. It was like feeling a pulse, a soft, steady pulse that seemed to resonate within me, just beneath my skin. A whisper brushed past my ear, a whisper that seemed to come from the very air around me, like a memory long forgotten. It was a bone-deep chill, the kind that presses into your skin and makes you shiver uncontrollably. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I was frozen in place, unsure of where the cold had come from. The warmth from the fire seemed to retreat, as though the flames themselves had taken a step back, leaving me vulnerable to something far colder than the night outside. I glanced around the room, my eyes scanning the walls, the windows, the doors, anything really. But there was no sign of where the draft had entered. I got up slowly, as if disturbed by something invisible, and moved toward the far corner of the cabin. I could feel the weight of those memories bearing down on me. as though the air were thick with the echoes of laughter and grief, all bound together by the threads of time. I stayed rooted by the mantel, unable to look away from the carving. My mind was flooded with questions, with fragments of images that seemed to flash before my eyes. People I couldn't see, moments I couldn't touch, all blending together in a silent, unseen dance. I felt an almost desperate need to understand, to unravel the mystery of this place. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't grasp what lay hidden beneath those lines. And then, just as suddenly as the sensation had begun, it stopped. The pulse beneath my hand seemed to fade, and the soft whisper dissolved into nothingness. I took a deep breath, my whole body shaking. I wanted to leave, to turn my back on the mantel and forget what I had seen, but something kept me there. It was as if I had to solve the mystery, to find the answers that lingered just beyond my reach, and so I stayed. In the morning, when I woke, there was nothing left but the stillness of the room and the distant sound of the wind outside, gently brushing against the cabin walls. The fireplace was empty, the strange blue lights gone, but the sensation of being watched lingered, like a faint echo, just beneath the surface of my thoughts. In the morning, when I woke, there was nothing left but the stillness of the room and the distant sound of the wind outside, gently brushing against the cabin walls. The fireplace was empty, the strange blue lights gone, but the sensation of being watched lingered, like a faint echo, just beneath the surface of my thoughts. And every now and then, I would find myself returning to the mantel, touching the wood with the tips of my fingers, feeling the same pulse beneath my hand. Somehow, I knew that there were more secrets hidden in this cabin than I could ever hope to discover. But rather than fear those secrets, I found comfort in them. They were like a whisper of the past, a reminder that some things are meant to remain mysteries, waiting for someone to come along and glimpse their fleeting beauty. And so, I sat by the fire, with the lingering sense of unseen eyes upon me, watching, listening, waiting for whatever might come next. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its warm glow flickering across the room, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched across the wooden walls. I sat in my favorite chair by the fire, the soft hum of the wind outside barely reaching me through the thick stone walls of the cabin. The snowstorm had picked up again, the snow now falling in a steady, unbroken blanket, covering the world outside in silence. Everything about the cabin felt at peace in that moment. The warmth of the fire, the stillness of the night, and the comfort of solitude. I sipped my hot cocoa, the sweet warmth mixing with the cozy comfort of the room. I could almost hear the fire whispering secrets, the logs groaning with the slow burn, the embers crackling softly like the murmurs of old voices. It felt safe, like a sanctuary. But then, out of nowhere, a sudden chill swept through the room. It wasn't the sort of cold that simply nips at the skin, like a draft sneaking in from an open window. No, this was something different. It was a bone-deep chill, the kind that presses into your skin and makes you shiver uncontrollably. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I was frozen in place, unsure of where the cold had come from. The warmth from the fire seemed to retreat, as though the flames themselves had taken a step back, leaving me vulnerable to something far colder than the night outside. I glanced around the room, my eyes scanning the walls, the windows, the doors, anything, really. But there was no sign of where the draft had entered. I got up slowly, as if disturbed by something invisible, and moved toward the far corner of the cabin. The chill was strongest there, near the old bookshelf where I had discovered the mysterious journal days before. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper seemed to curl through the air, faint and indistinct, like a voice carried on the wind. It was the kind of sound you might dismiss in the daytime, when the noise of the world drowns out the whispers of the unseen. But in the silence of the night, it was unmistakable. I froze, straining my ears, trying to catch any discernible words. The room seemed to grow colder still, as if the very air around me had thickened with something unseen. I could feel my breath misting in front of me, and I pulled my sweater tighter around myself, trying to ward off the icy sensation creeping over my skin. The fire should have been enough to keep the room warm. It was always warm, always comforting. But tonight, it was like the heat of the flames could not reach me. I turned toward the window, half expecting to see frost creeping in from the glass. But the view outside was obscured by the heavy snowfall, the world blanketed in white. Yet the chill lingered in the air, and it seemed to carry a presence with it, something unsettling and unnatural. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. It was just the storm, I told myself. Just the wind picking up, making its way through the cracks in the walls. But as I turned back to the hearth, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye movement, fleeting, like a shadow slipping past the edge of my vision. I blinked, and it was gone. Was it the flickering of the fire's light, playing tricks on my mind, or something more? I could feel my heartbeat quicken, the calm of the room shattered by a sudden, overwhelming sense of unease. The fire was still crackling, but the warmth from the flames now felt far away, like a distant memory. The cold continued to press against me, wrapping itself around my chest, squeezing, making it hard to breathe. A tightness settled in my throat, and I could feel the tension building inside me. With a shuddering breath, I reached for the blanket draped over the chair and wrapped it around myself, trying to shake off the feeling that someone was in the room with me. But the sensation of being watched, of being surrounded, only grew stronger. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaky beneath me, and I moved toward the mantelpiece where the strange carving had been. The symbol I had noticed earlier seemed almost to pulse with the firelight, the lines shifting ever so slightly as though the carving itself was alive, breathing with the rhythm of the flames. I placed my hand on the mantel, feeling the smooth, cool wood beneath my fingertips. But the sensation was different now. The wood felt cold, too cold, as though the hearth had no power over this particular part of the room. My pulse quickened again, and I jerked my hand back, as though I had been burned. But there was no flame there, only the sharp, unsettling cold. I turned quickly, my eyes searching the corners of the cabin for anything out of place. But there was nothing. Nothing except the oppressive silence, the shadows stretching unnaturally, creeping across the walls like tendrils reaching for me. I pressed my back against the cold stone of the wall, the chill seeping into my bones, and I forced myself to focus on the fire. Its orange glow was the only thing that felt real, the only thing that seemed to push back against the cold creeping through the room. And yet, the chill remained, stubborn and insistent. It wasn't like the cold of the outside world, biting and sharp. No, this was a deeper, more pervasive cold, as though the very air in the cabin had turned against me, withholding its warmth and leaving me to face the silence, the darkness, and the unseen force that had made its way into the room. I moved back toward the chair, my legs unsteady, the blanket wrapped tightly around my shoulders. The warmth of the fire called to me, but as I sat down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone in the cabin. The presence that had been creeping at the edges of my awareness was no longer subtle. It was there, close, almost suffocating in its stillness. I closed my eyes, telling myself it was just the storm, just my imagination running wild in the dark. But even as I tried to calm myself, I couldn't escape the sensation that something was watching me from the shadows. The cold continued to press against me, wrapping itself around my chest, squeezing, making it hard to breathe. A tightness settled in my throat, and I could feel the tension building inside me. With a shuddering breath, I reached for the blanket draped over the chair and wrapped it around myself, trying to shake off the feeling that someone was in the room with me. But the eyes were still there, in my mind, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The sensation of being watched lingered, and with each passing hour, the darkness outside seemed to press closer, wrapping the cabin in a tight, suffocating embrace. I stayed by the fire, trying to shake the unease, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just a trick of the night. But deep down, I knew there were things in that cabin, secrets hidden in the walls, in the shadows, and in the very air itself, things that would never truly be at rest. And as the night stretched on, I found myself listening, waiting for the next whisper, the next movement in the dark. The hours passed in a haze of quiet restlessness, the fire burning low in the hearth, casting soft, flickering shadows against the cabin walls. The presence, the one I couldn't shake, seemed to fade away as the night stretched on. Yet, I couldn't help but feel that the peace of the moment was fragile, like a thin veil that might tear at any second. The warmth from the fire, once comforting, now seemed distant, as if the flames themselves were fading. I sat there, wrapped in a thick blanket, staring into the fire as if I could find answers there. My mind raced, memories mingling with the strange chill I'd felt, the unsettling eyes that had appeared in the corner of my vision. But the warmth of the fire still whispered its reassurance, as if urging me to breathe, to let go of the tension and to listen to the night's song, the song of the pine trees outside. The wind had picked up again, its gentle howls slipping through the cracks in the cabin. I closed my eyes, letting the rhythm of the wind fill my senses. It was soft, almost like a lullaby, the way the wind rustled through the branches of the pine trees, bending them to its will. It wasn't harsh or violent, but a steady, melodic sigh that seemed to sweep over everything, calming and soothing. There was something about the sound of the wind and the pines that felt ancient, timeless, as though the trees themselves had been standing watch for centuries, listening to the wind's song, keeping secrets that only the mountains knew. I could imagine them swaying with the breeze, their branches creaking and groaning, but never breaking, always resilient, always part of the land. The wind carried their stories, whispered from tree to tree, and I wondered what secrets they might hold, secrets of the mountain and of the world long before I arrived. The wind howled again, but this time it felt different. There was a deeper resonance to it, a hum that seemed to stir something within me. I rose from the chair, my feet moving without much thought, drawn to the window where I had noticed the snow falling in thick, silent sheets earlier in the evening. I peered out into the night, the pale glow of moonlight filtering through the storm. Outside, the pines stood tall and proud, their needles dusted with snow, glistening under the thin moonlight. The wind swirled around them, and I could almost hear it singing, as if the trees themselves were responding to the melody of the storm. It was a sound that spoke of solitude and strength, of endurance through seasons and storms. a lullaby in the darkest hours of night. I let out a breath, feeling the weight of the quiet. The chill from earlier, the one that had crept into my bones, had vanished, replaced now by a calm, almost serene stillness. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, staring out at the mountains in the distance, watching as the snow continued to fall. The silence, broken only by the sound of the wind and the occasional rustle of the trees, wrapped itself around me like a blanket, and for the first time since I had arrived, I felt truly at peace. The air felt lighter now, the oppressive weight I had been carrying lifting ever so slightly. I could still hear the whisper of the wind through the trees, a sound that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat. There was something comforting about it, as though the wind itself was singing me to sleep, urging me to close my eyes and rest, to listen to the lullaby of the pines and let the world outside fade away. I returned to the fire, the room now feeling warmer again, the shadows less threatening. The fire had burned low, but the coals still glowed softly, casting a gentle light across the room. I sat back down in the chair, wrapping the blanket around me once more, and let my gaze drift back to the window. The wind had picked up again, its gentle howls slipping through the cracks in the cabin. I closed my eyes, letting the rhythm of the wind fill my senses. It was soft, almost like a lullaby, the way the wind rustled through the branches of the pine trees, bending them to its will. It wasn't harsh or violent, but a steady, melodic sigh that seemed to sweep over everything, calming and soothing. There was something about the sound of the wind in the pines that felt ancient, timeless. The feeling of being watched, the lingering sense of unease from earlier in the night, seemed to drift away on the wind, as if the trees themselves were carrying it into the night sky. I could still hear their song, soft and steady, like a lullaby meant to carry me into a peaceful sleep. The night continued its quiet song as I settled deeper into the chair, the warmth of the fire wrapping itself around me, and the wind outside gently swaying the trees in time with my breath. Slowly I let go of the tension, the fear and the unease, allowing the comfort of the moment to wash over me. In the solitude of the cabin, surrounded by the mountains and the song of the pines, I realized that this was exactly what I needed: the calm, the stillness, and the gentle whispers of the wind. It was a reminder that even in the darkest hours, there was beauty, there was peace, and there was a deep connection to something far older and wiser than myself. As I drifted off to sleep, the last thing I heard was the wind, its soft lullaby carrying me into dreams. It was a song that whispered of safety, of belonging, and of the timeless beauty that resides in the heart of the mountains. And in that moment, everything felt right. The world outside, the mysteries within the cabin, all faded away, leaving only the sound of the pines singing through the night. The fire flickered one last time before the warmth of its glow succumbed to the night, and in the soft embrace of the wind's song, I slept peacefully, knowing that the mountains, the trees, and the whispers of the world around me would keep me safe. The night had drawn its dark curtain over the mountains, and the fire crackled lazily in the hearth, its warmth spreading through the room like a gentle embrace. Outside, the wind had quieted, leaving the cabin in a serene, almost sacred stillness. The snowflakes continued their delicate descent from the sky, coating the world in a blanket of pure white. My heart skipped a beat, and I leaned forward, squinting to catch it again. Was it just a trick of the light? The dancing flames? Or was there something there, something more? I stared intently, holding my breath as I tried to make sense of what I had seen. For a moment, the shape was gone, swallowed up by the fire's shifting intensity. There was something magical about being so far removed from the chaos of the world, surrounded only by the whisper of the wind and the warmth of the fire. It felt like a retreat into a world where time slowed, where the demands of life faded, and where all that existed was this cozy, quiet space. But tonight, the stillness felt different. As I stared into the flames, watching the orange glow flicker and dance, a strange sensation crept over Mia's sense of being watched. I wasn't sure why or how, but it was there, heavy in the air, like the weight of an invisible gaze. I looked around the room, but the shadows remained just that, shadows. The firelight cast long, twisting shapes across the walls, the familiar patterns of flickering light that had comforted me so many times before. Then something caught my eye. A fleeting shape, just at the edge of the fire's glow, moved in the flames. It was like a shadow, but not a shadow. More like a form, a wisp, a flicker that seemed to belong neither to the fire nor to the room itself. My heart skipped a beat, and I leaned forward, squinting to catch it again. Was it just a trick of the light, the dancing flames, or was there something there, something more? I stared intently, holding my breath as I tried to make sense of what I had seen. For a moment, the shape was gone, swallowed up by the fire's shifting intensity. But then, there it was again, just for a second, hovering in the orange glow, moving in a way that no flame should move. My pulse quickened, and a chill ran down my spine, despite the warmth of the fire. Was it the reflection of something in the glass, the movement of the logs as they shifted? Or was there something else at play in this cabin, something that didn't belong? I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts clouding my mind. It must have been a trick of the fire, I reasoned. The flames were unpredictable, after all, shifting and changing with every breath of air, every crackle of the wood. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something more, something that seemed to flicker in and out of the fire like a whisper from another time. I stood up slowly, my feet cold against the wooden floor, and walked toward the hearth. I couldn't let my imagination run wild, I told myself. But as I got closer, I felt that same strange sensation, again, the feeling of being watched. My eyes scanned the flames, searching for whatever it was that had moved. And then I saw it. The shape, barely discernible, but unmistakable, drifted through the flames. It wasn't a trick of the light this time. No, this was something else. A shadowy figure, half-formed, with edges that blurred and shifted, as if it was made of smoke and fire. It hovered for a moment, almost as if it was aware of my gaze, before it melted back into the crackling warmth of the logs. My breath caught in my throat. A ghost? No, that couldn't be right. I wasn't a person prone to fanciful thoughts, and I didn't believe in things like that. But there was something undeniably eerie about what I had just seen, something that whispered of the past, of forgotten stories, of spirits that might linger in places like this, desolated, far from the world, where memories could settle and remain undisturbed for years. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest, and slowly sank into the chair once more. The fire crackled on its familiar rhythm, now tinged with something unsettling. The shape hadn't returned, but the feeling of something or someone lingering remained. My mind raced. Could there really be a presence here, in this cabin? Had the fire shown me something that I wasn't meant to see? Or was I simply imagining things? The room seemed to grow colder, despite the fire's warmth. A draft swept through the cabin, a faint whisper of a breeze that made the flames flicker, casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. The feeling of being watched never quite faded. I glanced at the windows, half expecting to see someone standing outside, but the world beyond the glass was dark, blanketed in snow and silence. I looked back at the fire, and for a moment it seemed as if the flames had quieted, as if the room itself had become still, waiting for something. The shadows in the corner seemed to shift again, moving with a life of their own, and I couldn't help but feel as though the cabin had secrets that it wasn't ready to reveal. For a long time I sat there, my eyes locked on the fire, my thoughts swirling. The flame's glow continued to flicker and dance, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just beneath its surface. Something ancient, something lost to time. Was it a ghost, or was it merely the play of light and shadow? I didn't know, and perhaps it didn't matter. But as I finally allowed my eyes to drift shut, the last thing I felt before the peaceful embrace of sleep took me was a lingering coldness, a sensation of being watched just beyond the edge of the fire's warmth. And in that quiet, uncertain moment, I realized that sometimes the stories of the past don't remain forgotten. They linger, waiting to be seen, waiting to be remembered, just like the flickering shadows in the flames. The night had fallen deep, like a thick velvet curtain drawn across the sky. The air outside was crisp and cold, with the faint rustle of snowflakes sifting through the trees. Inside the cabin, everything was quiet, save for the crackling of the fire. The logs in the hearth sent their warmth across the room, and I felt the weight of the silence settle in, almost too peaceful, like the calm before a storm. I had spent the evening wrapped in a blanket, nursing a cup of warm tea, watching the flames flicker and twist, consumed by thoughts that wandered untethered. The wind had picked up outside, howling faintly through the mountain passes. It was soothing, almost like a lullaby, or at least it should have been. But as the clock ticked toward midnight, something changed. The warmth from the fire no longer felt as comforting. The room, though familiar and safe, seemed to grow just a touch colder. And then I heard it. A knock. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, like the tapping of a finger against wood. I sat up straighter, trying to make sense of the sound. I could feel my heartbeat picking up its pace, a slight thrum that didn't belong in the quiet rhythm of the night. The knock came again, this time louder, clearer. A slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap. My gaze shifted to the door. It was an old wooden door, solid and weathered. Nothing special about it at all, that it had never once made a sound like this before. Not even during the worst of storms, when the wind rattled the windows and creaked the beams of the cabin. I had lived in this place long enough to know it sounds: the groaning of the floorboards, the shifting of the walls, the hum of the wind through the cracks. But this knock, it didn't belong. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry, the fire's warmth now feeling like a distant memory. My mind raced, trying to rationalize the situation. Could it have been the wind? Could the storm outside be playing tricks on me, making the door seem like it was being knocked upon? But there was something undeniably eerie about what I had just seen. Something that whispered of the past, of forgotten stories, of spirits that might linger in places like this related. Far from the world where memories could settle and remain undisturbed for years. I hesitated, my feet frozen to the floor. The warmth of the fire seemed to flicker with each tap, and for a moment I couldn't tell whether I was hearing the knocking inside my head or whether it was truly coming from the door. Was it a person? I thought of the road leading up to the cabin, how long and winding it was. It had been days since I last saw another soul, and the snow had only intensified since then. Slowly, cautiously, I walked across the room, my footsteps muffled by the old, creaking floorboards. The scraping sound continued, growing ever so slightly louder with each step. When I reached the door, I hesitated. I placed my hand on the cool, weathered wood. It felt strangely cold to the touch, as though it had absorbed the chill of the night outside. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky, barely louder than a whisper. There was no answer. I didn't breathe for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. My eyes darted around the cabin, scanning the familiar surroundings in a way I had never done before. Shadows, once comforting, now seemed menacing. The firelight flickered, casting long, erratic shapes on the walls. And then, just as I thought I could exhale, I heard it. A soft scraping sound, as if something was being dragged across the floor. I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could be heard all the way to the mountainside. The sound was coming from the direction of the door, just on the other side. My skin prickled. The air was thick now, suffocating. What was happening? What was out there? I forced myself to stand, though every fiber of my being screamed not to move. Slowly, cautiously, I walked across the room, my footsteps muffled by the old, creaking floorboards. The scraping sound continued, growing ever so slightly louder with each step. When I reached the door, I hesitated. I placed my hand on the cool, weathered wood. It felt strangely cold to the touch, as though it had absorbed the chill of the night outside. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky, barely louder than a whisper. There was no answer. I didn't breathe for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. My eyes darted around the cabin, scanning the familiar surroundings in a way I had never done before. Shadows, once comforting, now seemed menacing. The firelight flickered, casting long, erratic shapes on the walls. And then, just as I thought I could exhale, I heard it. A soft scraping sound, as if something was being dragged across the floor. The knocking started again, louder, stronger, unyielding. The room seemed to shrink with each sound, the walls pressing in, and the air grew thick, suffocating. It was as though someone was desperately trying to get in. My hand trembled on the door handle. I didn't want to open it. I couldn't. Yet the pull to do so, to confront whatever was outside, was irresistible. With a sudden burst of courage, or perhaps foolishness, I turned the handle and yanked the door open. The cold air rushed in, a sharp slap against my skin. But beyond the door, there was nothing. No figure, no person standing in the snow, no sign of anything at all. Just the emptiness of the night, the swirling snow, and the endless stretch of mountain. The doorframe was empty. I stepped outside, squinting into the darkness. The wind howled louder now, almost mocking me, and the snow fell in thick, heavy sheets. Yet there was no one. I stood there for a long moment, searching the night, my breath coming in sharp, rapid bursts. The cold seeped into my bones, but my eyes kept darting over the snow-covered ground, looking for any sign of life. But there was nothing. The knocking stopped. The scraping stopped. The night returned to its eerie quiet, and for a moment I questioned whether I had imagined it all. Had it been the wind playing tricks on me? Had I been dreaming, half awake, caught between reality and something darker? I closed the door slowly, locking it with shaking hands. Inside, I returned to the fire, though the warmth no longer offered comfort. The shadows around the room seemed darker now, more watchful, as if they had seen something I hadn't. But the door remained shut, and the silence hung heavy in the air. The knocking had stopped, but in the stillness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had come to visit me that night, something that hadn't quite left. The fire crackled gently in the hearth, its soft light painting golden patterns across the walls. Yet the room felt heavier now, as though the events of the night had left behind an unseen residue. I sat in the armchair, the warmth of the fire barely registering as I stared into the flickering flames. My mind buzzed with questions. What had I heard? Who or what had knocked on my door? The quiet grew almost oppressive, and I realized I needed to distract myself. Anything to shake off the lingering unease. I reached for a thick woolen blanket draped over the back of the chair and pulled it around me. My eyes wandered to the mantel, where the faint carvings I'd noticed earlier seemed to glimmer faintly in the firelight. They had become a mystery I had yet to solve, but tonight I wasn't in the mood to prod at the unknown. Instead, my thoughts drifted to an old story I'd once heard about this cabin. A tale shared by locals, back when I first purchased this place years ago. They called it the Tale of the Lost Traveler. It was one of those legends passed down from generation to generation, its details shifting like the snowdrifts outside. Yet its essence remained the same, a story of isolation, desperation, and the thin line between survival and surrender in the unforgiving mountains. As the story went, many decades ago, a lone traveler had ventured into these mountains during a particularly brutal winter. No one knew his name or where he had come from, only that he was searching for something, or perhaps running from it. He had underestimated the severity of the storm, and as the snow began to fall thicker and faster, he found himself hopelessly lost in the maze of icy trees and unmarked trails. The storm raged on for days, and the traveler's supplies dwindled. He trudged forward, half blinded by the snow, his strength failing. By sheer chance, or perhaps fate, he stumbled upon this cabin. Its sturdy wooden frame stood out starkly against the endless white, a beacon of hope in an otherwise desolate landscape. The cabin was abandoned at the time, its owners having left for lower ground, before the worst of the winter set in. But to the traveler, it was salvation. He forced open the frozen door, collapsed inside, and built a fire with what little wood he could find. For days he stayed there, waiting for the storm to pass, rationing the sparse supplies left behind by the cabin's owners. But as the days stretched into weeks, the traveler began to notice strange things. Whispers in the wind that didn't match the howl of the storm. Shadows flickering in the firelight, though no one else was there. And a growing sense that he wasn't alone in the cabin. According to the legend, the traveler began to lose his grip on reality. He claimed to see faces in the flames, hear footsteps pacing upstairs, and feel the presence of someone watching him from the corners of the room. Desperation turned to paranoia, and eventually, madness. When the storm finally cleared, the cabin's owners returned to find it empty. The traveler was gone. No footprints led away from the cabin, and his belongings were untouched. Some said he had ventured back into the wilderness, unable to endure the solitude. Others believed the mountain had claimed him, body and soul, leaving behind only whispers of his presence. The locals spoke of the traveler as though he still lingered here, a restless spirit tied to the cabin by his final days of despair. Some claimed to hear his faint knocking on winter nights, as if he were still searching for shelter. Others swore they'd seen fleeting shapes in the firelight, reflections of a man who had been lost to the snow. As I sat there, recounting the tale in my mind, a shiver ran through me. Not from the cold, but from the eerie parallels to my own experience tonight. The knocking, the strange sensations, the fleeting shadows. Had the legend come to life? Was it possible that the lost traveler had been at my door, seeking refuge once more? I glanced toward the door, its sturdy frame casting a long shadow across the floor. The night beyond it was silent now, the wind reduced to a faint murmur. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something unseen lingered, watching, waiting. The fire crackled again, louder this time, snapping me out of my thoughts. I leaned back in the chair, clutching the blanket tighter around me. The story was just that, the story. A tale spun to explain the unexplainable, to give shape to the fears that came with living in isolation. That's what I told myself, anyway. Still, as the night wore on, I found myself listening more closely to the sounds of the cabin, the groan of the floorboards, the faint whistle of the wind, the rhythmic dance of the fire. Each sound felt amplified, as though the cabin itself was alive, breathing alongside me. I thought of the traveler, imagined him sitting in this very chair, staring into the same flames, battling the same questions. Had he truly lost himself to the mountain's silence, or had he discovered something here that couldn't be explained? Something that had stayed with him long after his body was gone. I sighed, my breath mingling with the warm air of the room. The fire's glow began to soften, its flames shrinking as the logs burned low. The tale of the lost traveler lingered in my mind, not as a source of fear, but as a reminder of the thin line between solitude and connection, between the known and the unknown. As sleep began to pull me under, I whispered a quiet thought into the night, unsure if it was meant for myself or for the unseen presence I couldn't quite dismiss. Rest easy, wherever you are. And with that, I closed my eyes, letting the fire's soft light and the cabin's quiet embrace carry me into dreams. The fire had dwindled to embers, casting faint, pulsing glows onto the walls. The warmth was comforting, and the silence was so profound that I could hear the faint creak of the wooden beams settling under the weight of years. The night felt timeless, as though the cabin existed in a space suspended from the rush of the world outside. My thoughts wandered back to the old stories, the lost traveler, and the strange knock. But something else stirred in the air, a sensation I couldn't quite place. It was subtle at first, not a sound, but a feeling, a lightness, almost like the trace of a smile left behind. I straightened in my chair, letting the blanket fall slightly off my shoulders. The cabin had shifted, no longer heavy with mystery, but filled with something warm, almost inviting. It felt as though I were in the company of memories, as if the walls themselves were holding onto a time when this place was alive with joy. I closed my eyes, letting the sensation wash over me, and for a fleeting moment, I could almost hear it faint laughter, high and carefree, the sound of children playing. A soft murmur followed, as if a conversation was taking place somewhere just beyond my reach. My eyes snapped open, and the cabin was silent again, save for the crackle of the last embers. But the feeling lingered, and I couldn't shake the sense that I was brushing up against the cabin's history. I began to picture it not as the solitary retreat I'd come to love, but as a home filled with life. I could almost see a family gathered here, sitting where I now sat. The worn planks beneath my feet had once echoed with hurried footsteps, The walls had absorbed countless conversations, and the very air seemed to hum with the energy of lives lived fully. The mantel above the fireplace, with its mysterious carvings, suddenly felt less like a puzzle and more like a marker of something cherished, a piece of someone's story left behind. The worn planks beneath my feet had once echoed with hurried footsteps. The walls had absorbed countless conversations, and the very air seemed to hum with the energy of lives lived fully. The mantel above the fireplace, with its mysterious carvings, suddenly felt less like a puzzle and more like a marker of something cherished, a piece of someone's story left behind. I thought back to when I first discovered this cabin. It had been empty for years, its windows clouded with dust and its doors reluctant to open after so long without use. Yet even then, it had felt warm, welcoming. It had called to me, promising a sanctuary, a place to escape the noise of the world. Now I wondered if it had called to others before me, offering them the same refuge. As the night deepened, I allowed myself to imagine the faces of those who had lived here before. What had their lives been like? What dreams had they chased? What stories had they told around this very fireplace? The thought brought a strange sense of connection, as if I were a part of something much larger, a thread woven into the fabric of the cabin's existence. Whether I was speaking to the cabin, its long-gone inhabitants, or simply the night itself, I wasn't sure, but it felt right. The embers in the hearth glowed softly, their light dim but steady, as if they too held on to the warmth of past joys. I pulled the blanket closer around me, my eyes growing heavy. I leaned back, letting my gaze wander over the room. The shadows danced lightly across the ceiling, their movements slow and hypnotic. There was a peace in this moment that I hadn't felt in years, a sense that even in solitude I was not alone. The cabin wasn't haunted by sorrow or loss, but alive with the echoes of love and happiness. I allowed myself a small smile. "Thank you," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. Whether I was speaking to the cabin, its long-gone inhabitants, or simply the night itself, I wasn't sure, but it felt right. The embers in the hearth glowed softly, their light dim but steady, as if they, too, held on to the warmth of past joys. I pulled the blanket closer around me, my eyes growing heavy. Outside, the wind carried on its gentle lullaby, and inside, the cabin seemed to breathe with me, a quiet companion in the depths of the night. As sleep overtook me, I felt a sense of belonging I hadn't expected. The cabin, with all its mysteries and stories, had shared something with me, a glimpse of the life it had once held. I thought back to when I first discovered this cabin. It had been empty for years, its windows clouded with dust and its doors reluctant to open after so long without use. Yet even then, it had felt warm, welcoming. It had called to me, promising a sanctuary, a place to escape the noise of the world. Reaching into the small wooden chest by the corner, I found a candle. Its ivory surface was smooth and cold to the touch, and it carried the faintest scent of vanilla, barely perceptible but soothing. Striking a match, I watched as the flame flickered to life, its tiny brightness instantly softening the atmosphere. The light from the candle melded with the firelight, creating an almost magical interplay of warmth and shadow. I set the candle on the table near the window, where its glow danced faintly against the frosty glass. Its flame seemed more alive than the steady blaze in the hearth, swaying delicately as though responding to the whispers of the wind outside. The shadows it cast were gentler, more intimate, and they filled the room with a quiet heartbeat of their own. Sitting back in my chair, I let myself sink into the moment. The room seemed to shrink in the candlelight, not physically, but in its vastness. It was as if the walls leaned in closer, wrapping me in their embrace. The faint crackle of the fire mingled with the soft hum of the wind outside, creating a symphony of peace. I placed my hand over my chest, feeling the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat, slow and in sync with the pulse of the space around me. My mind wandered to the past, to times when life felt this simple and clear. Memories surfaced: family dinners lit by candlelight during power outages, moments where laughter filled the room and worries seemed to fade into the glow of a single flame. I hadn't thought about those days in years, but here, with the fire and the candle's gentle illumination, it all came back effortlessly. The shadows cast by the flame weren't just shapes on the wall. They carried a life of their own, shifting and weaving like they were telling a story in their silent, flickering language. One moment, they resembled the branches of a tree swaying in the wind. The next, they hinted at a pair of figures sitting close together, locked in conversation. It was as though the room itself remembered moments from its own history and played them out in these delicate silhouettes. I leaned forward, my elbows resting on my knees, and let my eyes drift across the room. The candle's glow caught the edges of the old charred book by the hearth, making it seem almost alive again, its secrets still waiting to be discovered. The carvings on the mantel seemed softer now, less ominous, as if the flickering light revealed their hidden gentleness. There was a strange comfort in how the firelight and candlelight blended, each playing its part in creating this serene tableau. It felt as though I were sharing the space, not just with the shadows, but with the unseen spirit of the cabin itself. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind against the windows, seemed to speak of life lived here life that now enveloped me in its embrace. I reached for my notebook, the one I had brought along with every intention of filling its pages with thoughts and reflections during this retreat. But as I opened it, I realized I didn't need to write anything. The moment didn't call for words. It simply needed to be felt. The candle flame danced higher for a brief second, as though agreeing with my decision. I closed the notebook and placed it back on the table. The soft crackle of the fire grew quieter, its embers glowing like the faint remnants of a sunset. Outside, the wind's song was gentle, like a lullaby sung by the mountains themselves. I leaned back, my head resting against the chair's high back, and let out a deep sigh. The room, the shadows, the warmth, they all held me in a kind of tranquility I hadn't realized I needed. My heartbeat slowed further, steady and calm, blending seamlessly into the rhythm of this timeless space. The candle burned steadily, its light unwavering now, as if it understood its role in this peaceful scene. It wasn't just a source of illumination, it was a companion, its presence as alive and comforting as the fire itself. Together, they filled the cabin with a rare kind of magic one that made the outside world seem distant and irrelevant. As my eyelids grew heavier, I allowed the quiet heartbeat of the room to guide me toward rest. The shadows grew softer, the fire dimmed to a low, comforting glow, and the candle continued its silent vigil. The cabin, with its flickering light and quiet embrace, had become a sanctuary, a place where even the simplest moments felt profound. And as sleep finally claimed me, I swore I could hear the cabin breathe, its own heartbeat slow and steady, cradling me in its timeless warmth. The room was cloaked in a deep and calming silence, broken only by the occasional crackle from the hearth. The fire burned low now, its embers glowing faintly like a guardian's watchful eyes in the dark. As I lay there, half reclined in my chair with a blanket draped over my legs, I became aware of something subtle, yet powerful. It wasn't a sound or a movement. It was a feeling, an inexplicable presence emanating from the fireplace itself. The warmth of the fire wasn't just physical. It felt deeper, as though the flames and the stone around them radiated an energy of protection. It wasn't just a source of heat. It was something alive in its own way. I couldn't explain it, but there was a quiet reassurance in its presence, as if the fire understood its role in this timeless cabin. The shadows it cast were soft and unthreatening, moving gently on the walls like a calming tide. They didn't flicker with the wild unpredictability of an open flame. Instead, they swayed as if guided by an unseen hand, steady and deliberate. Watching them was hypnotic, and I felt the tension in my body ease with every breath. For a brief moment, I wondered about the countless winters this fireplace must have endured. How many travelers, like me, had found solace in its warmth? How many stories had it silently witnessed? There was an undeniable sense of history etched into its stones, a quiet knowledge that made it feel almost human. Or perhaps more than human, something ageless, steadfast, and enduring. I pulled the blanket tighter and let my thoughts drift, comforted by the fire's glow. Its presence felt so unwavering, as though nothing beyond these walls could ever touch me while it burned. Even the distant wind, which had howled fiercely earlier, now seemed subdued. Its voice soft and mournful, as it whispered through the pine trees. The fireplace had taken command of the night, keeping the cold and the unknown at bay. I leaned forward, watching the embers pulse with faint light. They reminded me of a heartbeat, slow and steady, like the rhythm of the cabin itself. It was a quiet affirmation of life, a subtle reminder that even in the deepest solitude, something watched over me. My eyes traced the intricate carvings on the mantel above, symbols I hadn't noticed before. Delicate swirls and shapes that seemed to flow like water frozen in time. The carvings felt purposeful, as though they had been placed there not for beauty alone, but for protection. Their patterns whispered of rituals long forgotten, of hands that had chiseled them with care and intention. I reached out to trace one with my fingers, feeling the cool smoothness of the wood beneath my touch. A chill ran through me, not of fear, but of connection. Settling back into my chair, I closed my eyes for a moment. The sense of being watched over didn't feel invasive. It felt like the cabin itself was keeping me safe. The fire was its heart, the stone hearth its core, and the carvings its silent guardians. I felt enveloped by its presence, as if the cabin and its fire were protecting me from not just the cold outside, but from the intangible fears that lingered in the depths of the night. As my thoughts wandered, I realized the sensation wasn't new. I had felt it the moment I stepped inside this cabin, though I hadn't recognized it at the time. It was in the way the air seemed warmer than expected, the way the walls seemed to embrace rather than enclose. It was as if the fireplace had been waiting for me, its silent flame ready to offer comfort and companionship. I opened my eyes to find the fire burning lower now, its embers glowing softer. The room was bathed in a tender darkness, the kind that felt less like an absence of light and more like a comforting cocoon. The sense of protection remained, stronger than ever. The fire wasn't just an element, it was a sentinel, its gentle heat, a quiet promise that I was not alone. Lying back, I let the night envelop me. The fire whispered in its subtle way, its crackles and pops like words in a language I could only half understand. But the message was clear. Rest, be at ease, and let the night pass in peace. And as my breathing slowed, matching the soft rhythm of the embers, I felt an overwhelming gratitude. The cabin had become a sanctuary, and the fireplace its soulless, silent guardian watching over me as I drifted into the deepest, most peaceful sleep I had known in years. Morning had begun to creep into the cabin, the pale light filtering through frosty windows. The once dancing flames had now softened into a bed of quiet embers, their warmth still lingering. I leaned forward, drawn by the ashes in the hearth, gray and delicate, yet undeniably full of stories. The fire had spent itself throughout the night, and now, in the quiet aftermath, it left behind steeny remnants of logs once ablaze, pieces of a moment now past. My fingers instinctively brushed the blanket on my lap as I stared, my thoughts weaving into the ashes, wondering about the lives they had once touched. What had these flames illuminated before me? Who else had sought comfort here? The ashes seemed to hold whispers of the past, each flake a faint echo of laughter, whispered confessions, or simply the contentment of someone warmed by its glow. I let my gaze wander over the delicate patterns in the ash trails where fire had kissed the wood and left its mark. They reminded me of fleeting memories, the kind that fade as time moves on but never fully disappear. I imagined the stories embedded within them of family, perhaps, huddled close around this very hearth, their faces lit by the golden light. Or maybe a solitary traveler like me, arriving cold and weary, finding solace in the flickering warmth. The thought made me smile, bittersweet and contemplative. Fires have a way of connecting people across time, don't they? Their light is temporary, yet their presence leaves an imprint. I wondered how many winters this hearth had weathered, how many lives had passed through this cabin, all tied together by the same warmth that now cradled me. My hand brushed against the small poker resting beside the fireplace, its handle worn smooth from years of use. I picked it up and gently prodded the ashes, sending a few gray flakes spiraling upward, like ghosts of the wood they once were. They swirled briefly in the air before settling back into place. It felt almost ceremonial, as if I were sifting through layers of time. The ashes themselves seemed to tell a tale, their texture and form hinting at the wood that had fueled them. A thick piece here, likely the remains of a sturdy log that burned slow and steady. A finer dust there, the trace of a smaller branch consumed quickly by the flames. The ashes seemed to hold whispers of the past, each flake a faint echo of laughter, whispered confessions, or simply the contentment of someone warmed by its glow. I let my gaze wander over the delicate patterns in the ash trails where fire had kissed the wood and left its mark. They reminded me of fleeting memories, the kind that fade as time moves on but never fully disappear. I imagined the stories embedded within them, a family perhaps, huddled close around this very hearth, their faces lit by the golden light. Or maybe a solitary traveler like me, arriving cold and weary, finding solace in the flickering warmth. There was something sacred about these ashes, a reverence in their stillness. They spoke of endings but also of renewal, the next fire, the next moment of comfort waiting to be sparked. When I opened my eyes again, I noticed a faint shape in the ashes, almost imperceptible. It wasn't intentional, a mere trick of how the embers had settled, but it looked like the outline of a bird, wings outstretched. For a moment, it felt as if the fire itself had left a parting message, a symbol of freedom or flight, of something enduring even as the flames died out. I didn't disturb it. Instead, I let it remain, a quiet testament to the transient beauty of the fire's work. Rising from my chair, I wrapped the blanket around my shoulders and stood before the hearth. The room was still and silent, the morning's light growing stronger now. Yet the presence of the fire lingered, a companion even in its stillness. The ashes seemed to promise that the warmth would return, that the fire would live again when the next log was placed. And in that promise, there was peace. I whispered a quiet thank you to the fire, to the cabin, to whatever unseen force had brought me. Harand felt a sense of calmness unlike anything I'd known before. As I stepped away, I glanced back one last time, my heart full and my spirit at ease. The ashes lay there like a page turned in a book. Their story paused but never truly ended, waiting for the next chapter to begin. The cabin had grown still as the morning wore on. The fire was no longer a blaze, but a subtle warmth, a memory of its former intensity. I'd left the ashes undisturbed, their soft gray resting place untouched by time, and I turned my attention to the comforting rituals of the day, coffee in hand, watching the snowfall in steady rhythms. As night began to creep in, I relit the fire. The kindling crackled to life, sparks bursting like tiny stars before settling into the dance of flames. The room transformed once again into a haven of light and shadow, but as much as the fireplace glowed with warmth, an underlying stillness crept back in, one I hadn't noticed before, the kind of quiet that makes you pay attention. It began subtly, just a hint of sound carried in by the breeze that slipped through the cracks around the old wooden door. At first, I dismissed it, assuming it was the wind weaving through the pines, playing its familiar tune. But then, something changed. The sound seemed to take on a shape, a rhythm almost too intentional to ignore. I leaned forward, my head tilting toward the source. It wasn't music or the steady groan of wood settling. It was softer, thinner, like a whisper threading its way through the night. The voice, or at least what I thought was a voice, didn't speak words I could understand, just on the edge of hearing, like the wind had learned to mimic the cadence of human speech. It carried with it a strange harmony, a lulling quality that made me want to listen, even as a shiver rippled across my skin. Is someone there? My voice barely rose above the crackling fire. The question lingered in the air, unanswered except for the steady sound of the whisper, growing neither louder nor softer, simply present. I stood, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet as I moved closer to the door. The whisper followed, not louder but clearer, as though it wanted to be found. My hand hesitated on the doorknob. Something about the sound wasn't threatening it, didn't make my pulse quicken with fear. Instead, it brought a strange mix of curiosity and calm, as though it was calling not in warning but in invitation. With a deep breath, I pulled the door open. The cold night air rushed in, wrapping itself around me in an icy embrace. The snow outside reflected the moonlight, blanketing the world in an ethereal glow. The whisper seemed to fade into the wind, dissolving into the stillness of the forest. I stepped outside, the crunch of snow beneath my boots grounding me in the moment. The trees stood silent, their tall frames like sentinels guarding secrets too old to tell. And then I heard Edagina whisper, but now it felt like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Hello," I called out, my voice more resolute this time, though it sounded small against the vast expanse of the mountains. The whisper responded in its own way, not with words, but with a feeling, a sense of being seen, being heard. The wind shifted slightly, brushing past me as if carrying a message too delicate to articulate. My pulse slowed, my breaths evening out despite the cold. It was as though the cabin, the fire, and the mountains themselves were speaking in a language I could feel more than understand. I stayed outside for a moment longer, the snowflakes landing on my jacket and melting into tiny drops. The whisper eventually faded, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like a gift. As I turned to go back inside, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the forest. But there was only the snow, pristine and undisturbed. Closing the door behind me, I returned to the fireplace, its warmth wrapping around me like a blanket. The whisper lingered in my mind, not as a haunting memory, but as a gentle reminder that the world holds mysteries we aren't always meant to solve. Perhaps it was the cabin itself, alive in its own way, or the spirit of the mountains, ancient and watching. Whatever it was, it didn't ask for answers, only that I listened. The fire crackled, the flames flickering their own whispers in response. I settled into my chair, pulling the blanket tighter around me. The night continued its quiet song, and as my eyes grew heavy, I felt the peace of the mountains settle into my bones, the whisper now a memory that felt more like a friend. The warmth of the fire had become a gentle companion by now, its soft glow casting shadows that seemed to sway like dancers on the walls. The whisper from earlier still lingered faintly in my thoughts, but it had transformed into something comforting, a reminder of the mysterious bond between the cabin and its surroundings. I reached for the woolen blanket draped across the arm of the chair. It was heavy, its weave thick with the craftsmanship of another time. As I wrapped it around me, I could feel its embrace, like the cabin itself was offering one final gesture of comfort. The weight of the blanket was more than physical. It was grounding, a reassurance that I was exactly where I was meant to be. The chair cradled me as I leaned back, my body surrendering to the pull of relaxation. My eyelids grew heavier with each passing moment, the fire's rhythm matching the steady beat of my heart. The blanket seemed to hold a story of its own, each fiber infused with the memories of those who had sought refuge here before me. I wondered if they, too, had felt this same peace, this same release from the world beyond the mountains. Outside, the wind continued its quiet serenade, its melody weaving through the trees and against the cabin's walls. The snow whispered its secrets as it fell, soft and persistent, creating a world muffled in silence. I could almost hear the snowflakes landing, their touch delicate and deliberate. It was as if the entire landscape had conspired to create a perfect lullaby. I let my head sink into the chair's high back, my mind drifting through fragments of the day. As I turned to go back inside, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the forest. But there was only the snow, pristine and undisturbed. Closing the door behind me, I returned to the fireplace, its warmth wrapping around me like a blanket. The whisper lingered in my mind, not as a haunting memory, but as a gentle reminder that the world holds mysteries we aren't always meant to solve. The fire dimmed slightly, its once bold flames now a soft, glowing bed of coals. The light flickered like a heartbeat, steady and unhurried. I felt my breath match its rhythm, slow and deep, each exhale carrying away the remnants of tension. My body felt heavy, but in the best way, as though I was sinking into the chair and becoming one with the cabin. A yawn escaped me, unbidden but welcome. The kind of yawn that carries not just fatigue, but contentment, as if your body knows it's safe to let go. My thoughts began to blur at the edges, the line between waking and dreaming softening like the light of the fire. Somewhere in the haze, I thought I heard the whisper again, but this time it was within me, woven into the rhythm of my breathing and the beating of my heart. It wasn't a voice now, but a feeling, an echo of peace. The cabin, the fire, the mountains, they were all there, surrounding me like the blanket, holding me in their timeless embrace. My last conscious thought was of gratitude, a quiet thanks to the unseen forces that had brought me here, to this moment, to this stillness. And as sleep took me, it carried with it the warmth of the fire, the softness of the blanket, and the unshakable sense that I was home. The blanket's warmth was still wrapped around me, the fire now a low glow that cast gentle amber light across the room. Sleep hovered close, like a soft tide lapping at the edges of my consciousness. But something tugged at me, a quiet nudge to rise, to glance beyond the cabin's comforting walls. I hesitated, reluctant to leave the cocoon of warmth. Yet curiosity, gentle but insistent, urged me toward the frosted window. Rising from the chair, the blanket still draped over my shoulders, I shuffled across the creaking wooden floor. Each step was deliberate, as if the cabin itself wanted me to savor this moment of stillness. Reaching the window, I placed a hand on the icy glass. It was cool against my palm, a sharp contrast to the fire's lingering heat. The frost clinging to the pane formed intricate patterns, delicate as lace, shimmering faintly in the firelight. I wiped a small circle clear with my sleeve and pressed my face close, peering out into the night. The snowfield stretched endlessly before me, a pristine expanse bathed in the silvery glow of the moon. It was both breathtakingly beautiful and hauntingly vast, its surface untouched, save for the occasional shadow of a tree or the subtle dip of a hill. The moon hung low in the sky, its light so vivid it seemed to transform the landscape into something otherworldly. My breath fogged the glass, and for a moment I couldn't see. I stepped back, blinking, as if the enormity of what lay beyond had overwhelmed my senses. Then I leaned in again, this time noticing the details, the sharp edges of ice-crusted branches, the gentle rise and fall of snowdrifts that looked soft enough to sink into forever. There was a stillness out there, a silence so profound it felt alive. It wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of something deeper, a quiet that carried the weight of the mountains and the sky. It was as though the snowfield held secrets, whispered only to those willing to stand in its icy embrace. I scanned the horizon, my eyes adjusting to the moonlit glow. A faint movement caught my attention, a shadow shifting at the edge of the trees. My heart gave a small jolt, but as I squinted, I realized it was just the wind playing tricks, sending the branches swaying gently against the pale snow. Still, the moment lingered, a reminder of how the vastness of the world can feel both freeing and unsettling. The snow seemed to stretch beyond time itself, a frozen canvas painted with the quiet dreams of those who had wandered these mountains before me. I exhaled slowly, my breath misting the glass once more. The serene beauty of the view seeped into me, easing the tension I hadn't realized I was holding. The haunting vastness wasn't something to fear, but to marvel at, to embrace as part of the cabin's quiet magic. As I stepped back from the window, the blanket slipping slightly from my shoulders, I felt a renewed sense of calm. The fire flickered, its soft light welcoming me back into its embrace. I returned to the chair, wrapping myself once more in the blanket's comforting weight. Closing my eyes, I carried with me the image of the snowy abyss, its beauty a gentle reminder of the world's endless wonders. The cabin, the fire, the mountains, they were all part of the same story, one that whispered to me as I drifted into peaceful slumber. The fire had faded to a quiet glow, its warmth still lingering in the room like a comforting presence. Wrapped in the woolen blanket, I lay back in the chair, listening to the soft crackle of the remaining embers. The silence of the cabin was not completed, had its own language, a symphony of creaks and groans that played like a lonely song through the night. At first, it was the floorboards beneath the chair. A faint shift, a whisper of wood stretching or contracting as if sighing after a long day. The sound wasn't unsettling, but rather soothing, like the cabin itself was settling in for the night alongside me. I closed my eyes and smiled at the thought, imagining the structure as a living being, its walls and beams bearing witness to countless quiet evenings like this one. A soft creak from the rafters above drew my attention. My eyes drifted upward, tracing the dark, sturdy lines of the wooden beams. The sound reminded me of the gentle sway of an old tree in the wind, a natural rhythm that spoke of age and resilience. It was as though the cabin was humming to itself, a low, almost imperceptible tune that blended seamlessly with the stillness outside. The windows occasionally rattled, not in alarm, but in response to the wind brushing against the panes. It was a sound that felt ancient, like it had existed since the first cabin was ever built in the mountains. I imagined the wind carrying stories from the snowy fields, pressing them against the glass in hopes of sharing them with whoever might be inside. Even the hearth joined in the melody, the faint pop of a stubborn ember adding a subtle percussion to the cabin's song. I leaned back in the chair, letting the sounds wash over me, feeling more connected to the space than ever. These weren't just noises, they were the heartbeat of the cabin, a reminder that I wasn't truly alone. As the night deepened, the song became more intricate. A low groan came from the far corner where the walls met. I tilted my head, curious but unafraid, and imagined the beams shifting slightly under the weight of snow resting on the roof. The cabin was bearing its load like an old friend, accustomed to the demands of mountain winters. There was a faint scratching sound near the door, almost like a tiny creature testing its luck against the solid wood. I chuckled softly, picturing a curious squirrel or perhaps a brave mouse seeking refuge from the cold. The cabin, though solitary, seemed to welcome all with its warmth and safety, a haven for both weary travelers and nature's smallest inhabitants. Closing my eyes again, I let the cabin's lonely song envelop me. Each creak and groan, every subtle rattle and pop, felt like a lullaby crafted just for this moment. The solitude of the mountains, the glow of the fire, the melody of the cabinet was all part of an unspoken harmony, one that resonated deeply within me. As sleep began to pull me under, I thought about the countless nights this cabin had weathered, standing steadfast against time and nature. It had witnessed laughter, solitude, storms, and calm. Its song was not one of sadness, but of endurance, of quiet strength, and of the unyielding beauty found in stillness. Wrapped in the blanket, I allowed myself to drift, the cabin's song becoming the backdrop to my dreams. It was a melody I knew I would carry with me, a memory of a night in the mountains where even the quietest sounds told a story. The fire had been burning for hours now, casting a soft golden glow across the room. It was the kind of warmth that seeped deep into your bones, pulling every bit of tension from your body. I had spent the evening near the hearth, wrapped in the thick woolen blanket, watching the flames dance and flicker, listening to the occasional crackle of wood breaking apart in the fire. Time had slowed down, as it always did in the mountains, where the outside world felt miles away, and the only thing that mattered was the moment at hand. The fire had dwindled over time, the logs slowly turning into glowing embers. The flames had lost their intensity, their vibrant reds and oranges now replaced by gentle, fading hues of amber and gold. I knew it was almost time to end the evening. The night outside was still, silent, and the temperature had dropped even lower as the snow continued to fall gently on the mountain. The cabin had become a sanctuary from the cold, and I felt as though I could stay here forever, tucked away from the world in perfect solitude. But, as always, there was a ritual to complete. The last log, I stood slowly, my feet sinking into the soft rug beneath me, and approached the woodpile near the door. There was a quiet finality to the moment, a sense of ending, even though I didn't want it to end. I selected a heavy, well-seasoned log, its dark surface smooth and solid, ready to burn. I chuckled softly, picturing a curious squirrel or perhaps a brave mouse seeking refuge from the cold. The cabin, though solitary, seemed to welcome all with its warmth and safety, a haven for both weary travelers and nature's smallest inhabitants. Closing my eyes again, I let the cabin's lonely song envelop me. Each creak and groan, every subtle rattle and pop, felt like a lullaby crafted just for this moment. I knelt down beside the hearth and placed the log carefully onto the smoldering pile of embers. The wood fit perfectly, its surface absorbing the last of the heat, as if it had been waiting there all along. For a brief moment, nothing happened. The fire simply regarded the new addition with silent stillness. Then, with a soft hiss, the log began to catch. The first whisper of flame licked the edges, followed by a burst of orange light that sent a crackling sound into the room. The final log had been placed, and the fire was alive once more, but this time with a quiet, subdued energy. It was the last hurrah of the evening, a final act before the night claimed the cabin completely. I sat back in the chair, watching the fire now crackle and snap. The sound seemed to echo in the silence of the room, a reminder that even in endings, there is a brief moment of brilliance. I felt the warmth on my face, the heat from the flames still comforting and familiar, even though I knew it wouldn't last much longer. As I settled back into the blanket, pulling it a little tighter around my shoulders, I let the room fall into a peaceful stillness. The fire would die out soon, but there was no hurry. The last log, now burning steadily, seemed to mark the end of a perfect evening. The snow outside continued to fall in quiet sheets, the wind picking up slightly, whispering its secrets to the trees. But in here, in the cabin, it was a world unto itself. The hearth, the warmth, the quiet. All of it felt like a little sanctuary, a place of refuge from the cold and the world beyond. I closed my eyes for a moment, just listening to the fire as it slowly softened. The flames would eventually die out, leaving only the ashes as a reminder of the warmth that had filled the room. And when that happened, I would be left with the memory of this perfect evening, of a fire that had crackled and burned through the night, and of the peaceful, quiet moments that had made it all so unforgettable. As the fire flickered one last time, I let myself drift deeper into the blanket, feeling the weight of it, the warmth, and the peace that surrounded me. The night was calling, and the world outside the cabin seemed distant, as if it belonged to a place I had momentarily stepped away from. Soon, the last embers would be gone, and the cabin would return to its peaceful quiet. but for now I was content, wrapped in the blanket of the night and surrounded by the warmth of the fire that had once burned brightly. The perfect ending to a perfect evening in the mountains. The last log in the fireplace had finally burned down to a bed of glowing embers. The flames, once lively and full of energy, now flickered weakly, as though reluctant to let go of their warmth. I sat back in the armchair, my eyes fixed on the fire, watching the last traces of life vanish from the crackling wood. The room had grown quiet, save for the gentle hissing sound as the embers shifted and settled. The warmth was still there, lingering in the air, but it was fading. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the cabin was beginning to cool down. The cozy, inviting atmosphere that had surrounded me all evening was now slipping away, like sand through fingers. I couldn't help but feel a sense of melancholy as I watched the fire's farewell glow. It wasn't just the heat that would soon be gone, but the very presence of the fire itself, the way it had filled the room with light, the way it had made everything feel safe and comfortable, as though nothing could touch me here in the quiet mountain cabin. Now, all that remained were the glowing embers, slowly turning into ash, a soft red light that seemed to pulse and fade, like the heartbeat of the night. I could feel the weight of the moment, the weight of saying goodbye to something that had given me so much warmth, both literal and emotional. The fire had been my companion all evening, a constant source of comfort. And now it was retreating into the cold darkness outside, leaving only the memory of its heat. I leaned forward in the chair, my fingers brushing the edge of the hearth, where the last embers shimmered faintly. I could feel the residual warmth on my skin, and it almost seemed to whisper to me, urging me to hold on a little longer. I was reluctant to leave the fire's embrace, as though stepping away from it would mean leaving behind the peaceful serenity that had settled in my bones, but I knew it had to happen. The fire, like all things, had its time, and now it was over. The flickering embers were the final remnants of its energy, and as they slowly dimmed, the cabin seemed to grow quieter, as though the earth itself had taken a deep breath and was waiting for something else to happen. The wind outside had picked up, and I could hear it howling through the trees, a soft, mournful sound that seemed to echo the fire's own retreat. The snow outside, which had been falling so steadily earlier in the evening, now drifted in heavier gusts, a blur of white against the dark sky. It was as though the world outside was pressing in on the cabin, the storm's cold fingers reaching toward the warmth that was slowly disappearing. I sat still, watching the last bit of the fire, watching the embers shift from orange to a dull red, and then finally to a soft gray. There was something so final about it, a sense of closure that seemed to wrap around me like a blanket, pulling me into the stillness of the night. As the fire's glow finally faded, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm. The cabin, now dark except for the faint light from the window, was quiet again, but this time in a different way. It was no longer the comforting quiet that the fire had provided, but a peaceful, almost sacred silence, as though the room itself was resting after the day's warmth. I took a deep breath, letting the quiet settle into my chest. The world outside the cabin, with its cold and wind and snow, felt distant now, as if it were a different world entirely. In here, it was just me and the memory of the fire, the warmth that had filled the room for hours, now slipping away into the night. The embers were gone now, the hearth cold. The only sound that remained was the faint creaking of the cabin as it settled into the night, a subtle reminder that even in stillness there is movement. I stood slowly, stretching my arms above my head and yawning. The blanket that had kept me warm all evening now felt heavy around my shoulders, a reminder that the night was far from over, but I felt no urgency to move. The fire may have gone out, but the peace it had left behind still lingered, a warmth that wasn't just physical, but deep within me. I walked over to the window, pulling the curtain back slightly to look out at the snow-covered landscape. There was something so final about it, a sense of closure that seemed to wrap around me like a blanket, pulling me into the stillness of the night. As the fire's glow finally faded, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm. The cabin, now dark except for the faint light from the window, was quiet again, but this time in a different way. There was a calmness to it now, a sense of completion, as though the fire had done all it needed to do, and now it was time to rest. I turned away from the window and made my way to the bed, the soft carpet beneath my feet muffling my steps. The room felt colder now, but it was a welcome chill. Outside, the wind had calmed, and the snow fell silently, like feathers from the sky, settling in layers on the ground. It was a peaceful silence, the kind that invites the mind to wander, to drift into a state of calm surrender. I pulled the blanket up higher, feeling its softness surround me, and closed my eyes. The room was dim, the moonlight spilling through the window, casting gentle shadows on the walls. And as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that the fire's farewell glow would stay with me, a memory of warmth and peace that would carry me through the night, just as it had carried me through the evening. The cabin was quiet now, the air cool and crisp against the warmth of the blankets that cocooned me. The fire was long gone, leaving only the soft, lingering memory of its heat and the faint scent of wood smoke in the air. Outside, the wind had calmed and the snow fell silently, like feathers from the sky, settling in layers on the ground. It was a peaceful silence, the kind that invites the mind to wander, to drift into a state of calm surrender. I pulled the blanket up higher, feeling its softness surround me, and closed my eyes. The room was dim, the moonlight spilling through the window, casting gentle shadows on the walls. It felt like a space outside of time, a world where only quiet mattered, where only rest could be found. The silence grew deeper, stretching out around me like a gentle lullaby. The creaking of the cabin's wooden beams was barely audible now, as if the house itself had settled into a deep, peaceful sleep. The moon was high in the sky, casting a pale light over the blanketed mountains. Everything seemed so still, so perfect in its quiet solitude. The cabin, now dark and empty of light, felt like a small island in the vast sea of snow and forest, a safe harbor from the storms beyond. As I gazed out into the night, I realized that this was enough. The fire had served its purpose, and now the night would carry me through the hours ahead, with its cool air and stillness. A soft, gentle sound, as if someone were speaking from far away, their voice barely audible. I couldn't make out the words, but it didn't matter. There was something soothing in it, something familiar, as if the very air in the room was alive with stories waiting to be told. I turned my head toward the window, watching the snowflakes dance in the moonlight, each one unique and fleeting. The world outside seemed so distant, so far removed from the warmth of the cabin. It was as if I were wrapped in a blanket of time itself, where the past and future didn't matter, only the present moment, the soft whisper of the wind, and the promise of rest. The whisper seemed to pull me deeper into the quiet, as if it were a lullaby sung by the mountains themselves. I could almost feel the earth beneath me, the deep ancient roots of the trees, and the snow-covered peaks that rose up to meet the sky. The mountains had always had a way of speaking to me, even in their silence. It wasn't something that could be understood with words, but rather felt in the heart, like a secret shared between the land and the soul. As the night stretched on, I could feel myself slipping further into a peaceful, dreamlike state. The warmth of the blankets, the soft whisper of the wind, and the quiet embrace of the cabin all conspired to guide me toward sleep. My body grew heavier, my breath slowing, and the world outside faded into the background. All that remained was the promise of dreams. I could see it now, vivid images in my mind's eye. The snow falling in delicate flakes, the trees standing tall and proud against the darkened sky, their branches heavy with the weight of winter. The fire was still burning, crackling merrily in the hearth, but it was no longer real. It was a part of the dream, a flicker of light and warmth amidst the vast, quiet mountains. I could feel the stillness of the night wrapping around me, like a cloak, pulling me deeper into a world where time didn't exist. The mountains whispered in my dreams, their ancient voices carrying stories of the land, of travelers who had come and gone, of seasons that had come and passed. The whisper was comforting, as if it were guiding me, leading me towards something unknown yet familiar. There was a sense of peace in it, a knowing that I was exactly where I needed to be, in this quiet cabin in the heart of the mountains, listening to the soft, gentle whispers of the world around me. I drifted deeper into my dreams, the images becoming clearer, more vivid. I could feel the snow beneath my feet, cool and soft, as I walked through the moonlit forest. The trees whispered in the wind, their voices soft and ancient, telling stories of long ago. I felt the presence of something greater than myself, something timeless, as if the mountains themselves were watching over me, guiding me, protecting me. In the distance, I could see the faint glow of the firelight, beckoning me back to the warmth of the cabin. But for now, I was content to remain in the dream, to let the whisper of the mountains carry me deeper into the night, into the peaceful embrace of sleep. The quiet of the room, the promise of dreams, and the gentle whisper of the wind all came together, creating a sense of calm and tranquility that I had never known before. I felt weightless, as if I were floating in a world where nothing could touch me, where only peace and rest existed. The mountains had shared their secret with me, and now it was time to listen, to surrender to the stillness, and to let the dreams come. And so I slept, wrapped in the quiet of the cabin, the snow falling softly outside, the mountains whispering their stories to me as I drifted deeper into the world of dreams. The night was long, but it was a peaceful one, a night of rest and renewal, where the only sound was the soft, gentle whisper of the wind through the trees, carrying me toward sleep and the promise of another day in the mountains. The fireplace may have been out, but its warmth lingered in my heart, as did the whispers of dreams awaiting me. And as I closed my eyes, I knew that tomorrow would bring new stories, new adventures, and the same quiet peace that the mountains had always provided. The night had settled in completely now, the cabin wrapped in a blanket of peace that only the mountains could provide. It wasn't the kind of stillness you'd find in the busy hum of the world. No, it was something deeper. The fire was still burning, crackling merrily in the hearth, but it was no longer real. It was a part of the dream, a flicker of light and warmth amidst the vast, quiet mountains. I could feel the stillness of the night wrapping around me, like a cloak pulling me deeper into a world where time didn't exist. The mountains whispered in my dreams, their ancient voices carrying stories of the land, of travelers who had come and gone, of seasons that had come and passed. The whisper was comforting, as if it were guiding me, leading me toward something unknown yet familiar. I sat back in the armchair, a soft woolen blanket draped over my shoulders. The soft rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound now, each second passing like a gentle whisper, urging the world to slow its pace, to rest. Outside, the world was a darkened canvas of snow and shadows. The wind had gone to sleep too, leaving nothing but the occasional soft brush of snowflakes against the cabin's windows. It felt like the world outside had paused, as if everything was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when it was allowed to breathe again. Inside, though, there was no need for breathless waiting. The cabin held its own peace. The heavy beams of wood above me seemed to hum with history, as if they, too, were part of this timeless quiet, built to endure the years and the seasons. Every crack in the walls, every knot in the wood, seemed to hold a secret story from long ago, whispered only to those willing to listen, and I listened. Oh, how I listened, as the night grew deeper, my mind wandering in the stillness of this place. There was a particular kind of comfort in being here, in the midst of these ancient mountains. It wasn't just the solitude, though, that was part of it. It wasn't the fire, though it had offered its warmth. It was the stillness, the absence of chaos, of the demands of the world. In this cabin, in this moment, all of that faded away, leaving only the peace of the present. Every thought, every worry, every burden that I had carried from the outside world melted into the soft embrace of the cabin. The cabin itself felt alive with this peace. It was more than just walls and windows, beams and floors. It was a living thing, a shelter that cradled me in its arms, allowing me to rest in a way that felt so deeply necessary. I didn't need to force anything here. The worries, the expectations, the stress, all of it dissolved into the quiet. It was as if the cabin had a way of absorbing it all, taking it away from me, leaving me lighter, freer. I sat back in the armchair, a soft woolen blanket draped over my shoulders. The soft, rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound now, each second passing like a gentle whisper, urging the world to slow its pace, to rest. Outside, the world was a darkened canvas of snow and shadows. The wind had gone to sleep, too, leaving nothing but the occasional soft brush of snowflakes against the cabin's windows. I could feel my muscles loosening, my body sinking deeper into the chair, the weight of the day lifting off my shoulders. I was not sure when it had happened, but I had become part of this peaceful rhythm. The ticking of the clock, the faint crackling of the dying embers in the hearth, even the silent snowfall outside, all of it, blended together in a seamless symphony of calm. I could feel my breathing slow, the tension in my body unraveling with each gentle exhale. The cabin held me like a familiar song, a lullaby sung by the mountains themselves. The quiet had become so full, so rich, that it seemed to hold more than just the present moment. I thought of all the people who had come before me, who had sat by this fire, wrapped in blankets, listening to the wind howling outside, feeling the same peace settle into their bones. The cabin, the mountains, the earth they had witnessed so much over the years. And yet, each night, they welcomed a new soul, a new body to rest, to reflect, to be held in the quiet embrace of this place. It was almost as though the cabin knew that, like all things, I needed this rest. And it gave it to me freely, without question. There was no hurry here, no agenda. Just the moment, just the night. And in this moment, I knew that nothing needed to be done, nothing needed to be fixed. The peace of the cabin was enough. As I gazed into the fading embers, my mind wandered, but it didn't wander to places of worry or anxiety. Instead, it drifted to thoughts of gratitude. How strange it was, I thought, that something as simple as a room, a fire, a blanket, could hold so much power. But in this space, it was true. The cabin's heart, the peace it held, was not just a fleeting thing it was enduring. It had lived through seasons, through changes, and had remained steadfast in its quiet beauty. And now, in this moment, it was offering its stillness to me, its peace, its warmth. There was no hurry, no pressure, no rush. Only this night, this silence, and the soft whisper of the wind outside. I could feel the quiet weaving its way deeper into my bones, into my soul, until it became part of me. The room felt fuller now, richer in its silence. I could almost hear the mountains breathing, steady and calm, as if they too had settled into the peace of the night. The cabin was alive with this peace, and so was I. There was no need for anything more. All that I needed was right here. And in that moment, I let myself slip deeper into the warmth of the blanket, letting the peaceful heart of the cabin guide me into sleep. The mountains whispered their quiet lullaby, and the world outside seemed to pause, holding its breath. I was safe here, in this embrace of silence. All of my worries had dissolved into the warmth of the night, leaving me in perfect peace. And as I closed my eyes, I knew that I would sleep deeply, without fear or restlessness, for I was held in the peaceful heart of the cabin, and that was enough. The night had been long and deep, a silence woven so tightly into the air that it seemed to hold the very essence of the mountains themselves. I had drifted off to sleep, the fire's last embers a comforting glow, the blanket of the cabin's peace still wrapped around me. Sleep had come easily, as it often does in the heart of the mountains, where the world's clamor feels distant and irrelevant. The quiet was all-encompassing, and for a while I had allowed myself to surrender to it completely. But now, as the hours ticked by, the first stirrings of a new day began to creep into the cabin. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, with the softest shift in the air and unmistakable change in the quality of the light. A faint glow, barely perceptible at first, began to slip through the thin gap between the curtains, casting a pale hue on the wooden walls. The darkness of the night had been so deep that it seemed impossible for anything to break through. But there it was, a hint of dawn, slipping in gently, like the first brush of a lover's touch. I blinked, my body slowly emerging from the haze of sleep, but I didn't rush to wake. Instead, I lay still, watching as the first rays of light stretched across the floor, warming the cool wood with their gentle embrace. The shadows of the night, so thick and heavy just hours ago, began to recede, giving way to the soft light of morning. It was a gradual transformation, as if the earth itself was stretching, waking slowly from a deep slumber. I had always loved this moment, the moment before the day truly began, when the world seemed suspended in time. It was as though the mountains, the trees, the snow, and the very air itself were holding their breath, waiting for the first full rays of light to burst forth and bring the world to life again. And yet, there was something bittersweet about it. The quiet of the night, the warmth of the fire, the stillness that had wrapped itself around me so completely, these things were slipping away. And with them, a small part of me wanted to hold onto that peace just a little longer. I pulled the blanket more tightly around my shoulders, as though I could hold on to the night a bit longer. keep the stillness at bay. The last remnants of the fire in the hearth were now just faint, glowing embers, their warmth still present but fading. The cabin, once alive with the flickering light of the fire, now seemed almost still, as though it, too, was reluctant to say goodbye to the night. The world outside, blanketed in snow, was still untouched by the busy pace of the day, as if it too wished to remain in the embrace of the night's peaceful solitude. But as the light of the morning grew stronger, I knew the moment had come. The night was ending. The cabin, though still filled with warmth, was slowly waking from its slumber, and so was I, the world outside, bathed now in soft pinks and oranges as the sun made its way above the horizon, beckoned me toward the new day. It was time to rise. I stood from the chair, my body stiff from sleep, and walked over to the window. The snow outside shimmered under the first full light of day, sparkling like a blanket of diamonds stretching out into the distance. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches heavy with snow, their silence a quiet reminder of the night that had passed. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also the start of something new, a new day that would soon demand its own rhythm, its own pace. The stillness of the night had been replaced by the quiet promise of a busy day ahead. For a moment, I just stood there, watching the light grow, the world coming to life around me. I could hear the faint creaking of the cabin as it settled into the new day, the wood shifting and groaning gently as it always did when it adjusted to the changes in temperature. And I felt, deep within me, the echo of the night's peace, lingering like a memory I wasn't quite ready to let go of. But the truth was, it was time. The fire had faded, the night had passed, and the first light of dawn had entered the cabin, bringing with it the world's promise of a new day. The peace I had felt, the quiet of the mountains, the warmth of the cabin, those things would stay with me, but the world outside would soon be filled with the busy rhythms of life. I had come to this place for rest, for a reprieve from the world's noise, and now it was time to return to that world, to carry with me the stillness of the night into the hustle of the morning. A small tear gathered at the corner of my eye, not from sadness, but from the realization that the peace of this night, this moment, was fleeting. It was the nature of life, wasn't it? A constant ebb and flow. The stillness of the night would always give way to the light of the morning. And while I would carry a piece of the quiet with me, it would never quite be the same again. I would have to wait for another night to feel it again, to sink into the depths of the mountain's embrace, to be held in the arms of the cabin once more. But for now, there was only the light of the morning, the snow outside, and the quiet, gentle promise of a new day. I wiped the tear away, smiling softly to myself. It wasn't a tear of regret. It was a tear of gratitude for all that the night had given me. The warmth of the fire, the peace of the mountains, the embrace of the cabinet had all been a gift. And now it was time to carry that gift with me as I stepped into the world once more. The mountains would remain as they always had, standing tall and silent, holding their secrets, their stories, and the cabin, though now quiet in the light of day, would always hold the memories of the night. I would carry them with me, tucked away in the corners of my heart, until the next time the fire would burn bright, and the mountains would once again offer me their quiet peace. And so, with the first rays of the sun warming my face, I stepped away from the window, ready for the day ahead. But I knew, deep down, that the peace of the mountains, the warmth of the fire, would always be there, waiting for me to return. And until that time came, I would hold it in my heart, my own quiet, sacred place.